The dashboard clock glowed a pale, sterile blue in the darkness of the driveway. 11:42 p.m. Elias sat behind the leather steering wheel of his sedan, the engine turned off, listening to the rhythmic, metallic ticking of the cooling exhaust block. It was the only sound in the suffocating quiet of the suburban night. He did not move. His hands remained draped over the bottom curve of the wheel, his knuckles white, the tendons in his wrists aching with a dull, persistent throb that had begun somewhere around hour 9 of his workday. He leaned his head back against the headrest. The stiffness of his tailored suit jacket dug into his shoulders, a physical reminder of the partners' meeting he had just left. At the firm, his time was billed in 6-minute increments at $750 an hour. His words moved millions of dollars, dissolved corporate entities, and shielded executives from ruin. But here, parked on the cracked concrete of his own driveway, his time held an entirely different currency. Here it was weightless, expected, infinite. Elias unbuckled his seatbelt. The click was sharply loud in the enclosed space. He picked up his briefcase from the passenger seat, 12 pounds of Moroccan leather and dense, heavily annotated case files, and stepped out into the humid night air. The walk to the front door was a measured routine. 3 steps up the brick porch, the slide of the deadbolt, the quiet creak of the weather stripping giving way. Inside, the house was dark, save for the blue-white glow spilling from the kitchen. The air in the foyer was thick. It smelled of stale garlic, cooling cooking oil, and the sharp, artificial lemon scent of a wet sponge left too long on the edge of the sink. Elias slipped his dress shoes off, lining them up perfectly parallel to the baseboard. From the living room, the abrasive staccato noise of a smartphone video echoed off the drywall. A harsh laugh track, a synthesized beat, then a swipe, followed by another disjointed audio clip. Elias walked into the kitchen. Trent, Clara's younger brother, was sitting at the island. He was illuminated by the harsh overhead pendant light, wearing sweatpants and a faded T-shirt, shoveling a bowl of Elias's imported granola into his mouth. Trent did not live here. He had his own apartment across town, but he had a habit of appearing when he needed something, lingering like a draft in an old house. Trent did not look up when Elias set his heavy briefcase down on the granite counter. The thud was substantial, but Trent's eyes remained glued to his screen, his thumbs swiping upward in a hypnotic, endless rhythm. "Hey," Trent said, the word muffled around a mouthful of milk and oats. "Evening, Trent," Elias said. His voice was low, scraped hollow by hours of negotiating a hostile merger. He reached up and loosened his silk tie, pulling the knot down exactly 2 inches. He felt the cold air hit his damp collarbone. "You're back late," Trent noted, though it wasn't a question, nor did it carry an ounce of curiosity. He finally glanced up, his eyes glassy from screen fatigue. "Hey, did you look at that thing I emailed you?" Elias paused. He looked at the refrigerator. The compressor kicked on with a low, vibrating hum that seemed to rattle the plates in the cabinets. That thing was a 50-page commercial lease agreement for a vapor shop Trent was trying to open with 2 partners who had 0 capital and a history of tax liens. It was a labyrinth of predatory clauses, joint and several liability traps, and personal guarantee demands that would have financially ruined Trent within 6 months. Elias had spent 3 hours of his Sunday morning before the sun came up, redlining the entire document, rewriting the indemnification clauses, and drafting a counterproposal that effectively shielded Clara's family from the blast radius of Trent's inevitable business failure. If Trent had walked into Elias's office downtown and asked for that level of structural risk analysis, the retainer would have been $5,000. Elias looked at his brother-in-law. A familiar, heavy calculation began in the back of his mind. He weighed the energy it would take to explain the concept of a personal guarantor clause, the energy it would take to emphasize the severity of the financial risk he had just mitigated, against the energy it would take to simply nod. The metabolic cost of making Trent understand was too high. The return on investment was zero. "I sent the revised draft to your landlord's counsel at 4:00, Elias said quietly, walking past Trent to the cabinet to retrieve a glass. "Cool," Trent said, looking back down at his phone. Another video started playing, someone falling off a bicycle. "The guy's being a total hard-ass about the deposit. I told him my lawyer would chew him out. Did you chew him out?" "I amended the terms to reflect a standard escrow holdback," Elias replied, turning the faucet on. The water sputtered, running cloudy for a second before clearing. "He'll accept it." "Yeah, whatever. Just as long as he backs off," Trent muttered, scraping the bottom of the ceramic bowl with his metal spoon. The sound set Elias's teeth on edge. "Clara went up to bed like an hour ago. Left some mail for you." Trent pointed his spoon vaguely toward the far end of the kitchen counter before returning to his phone. Elias drank the tap water. It was lukewarm and tasted faintly of copper, but it coated his dry throat. He set the glass down and walked to the end of the counter. There, resting directly on top of Elias's own unopened stack of mail, bills, a letter from his mother, a medical insurance statement, was a thick manila envelope. It was stained with a ring of coffee on the bottom left corner. Slapped squarely in the center of the envelope was a fluorescent pink sticky note. Clara's handwriting looped across it in hurried, dark ink. "Dad got this from the city today. Code enforcement or something? He's freaking out. Please look at it before breakfast so I can call him and tell him it's fine. C." Elias stared at the neon pink square. Please look at it before breakfast? He calculated the hours. It was nearly midnight. He had to be back at the firm by 7:30 a.m. to finalize the merger documents. He needed to shower. He needed to sleep. He reached out and traced the edge of the stiff manila envelope with his index finger. Beneath it, his own mail was completely obscured, buried under the weight of his father-in-law's latest administrative disaster. Gary Miller was a man who operated on the belief that rules were suggestions meant for other people, right up until the moment a fine arrived in the mail. Last year, it was an unpermitted deck expansion that encroached on a municipal utility easement. Elias had spent 2 weeks quietly filing variances and leaning on a contact in the zoning office to make it disappear, saving Gary $14,000 in demolition fees. Gary had thanked him by complaining that the city was a racket and asking Elias why the variance paperwork took so long to process. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to grow louder, filling the kitchen with a dull, oppressive vibration. Elias felt the familiar tightening in his chest, a slow, twisting knot of unspoken labor. He did not sigh. He did not complain to Trent. He simply slid the manila envelope out from under the sticky note, picked up his 12-pound briefcase and turned off the kitchen light, leaving Trent sitting in the dark with the glow of his screen and the empty bowl. Elias walked up the carpeted stairs, the manila envelope held tightly in his hand, his thumb resting directly over his wife's hurried, demanding script. The bedroom door did not creak, but the brass handle had a slight, loose play in it that clicked if turned too quickly. Elias turned it with slow, deliberate pressure, stepping into the dimness of the master's suite. The room was cool, conditioned to a steady 68 degrees. The faint, powdery scent of lavender hand cream hung in the air, a scent Clara had used for the 7 years of their marriage. On her side of the bed, she was a quiet silhouette beneath the duvet, her back turned to him, the soft, rhythmic puff of her breathing indicating she was asleep. Or nearly asleep. On her nightstand, her phone screen flashed once, a silent notification from a group chat, lighting up her water glass with a brief, icy blue glow before fading back to dark. Elias walked to his dresser. He set the manila envelope down next to his watch tray. The sound of the thick paper sliding across the polished mahogany was like dry leaves scraping pavement. He began his nightly decompression. First, the watch. He unclasped the heavy steel band of his chronograph, the metal links clicking softly as he laid it in the velvet-lined tray. Next, the cufflinks. 2 small silver bars clicked out of his French cuffs and set side by side. He unbuttoned his shirt, feeling the cool air of the bedroom hit his chest, shrinking the fabric away from his skin. He moved to the closet, his bare feet sinking into the thick pile of the carpet. He took a cedar hanger from the rack. The wood smelled sharp and clean, a stark contrast to the stale kitchen grease downstairs. He draped his trousers over the felt bar, aligning the creases perfectly, then hung the jacket. It was a ritual of preservation. At the firm, a wrinkled suit was a sign of a disordered mind. Elias did not allow himself wrinkles. When he stepped back into the bedroom, Clara shifted. The mattress groaned slightly under her weight as she rolled over, her eyes half open, squinting against the dim hallway light filtering through the cracked door. "You're late," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep, her arms sliding up to rest under her pillow. "The partner meeting ran over," Elias said. He reached for his gray cotton t-shirt, pulling it over his head, and Trent was in the kitchen. Clara didn't comment on Trent. She rarely did. Trent's presence in their house was treated like the weather, an unpredictable but ultimately unchangeable reality that everyone simply had to work around. "Did you see the envelope?" she asked, her voice dry. She cleared her throat, not looking at him, but rather at the ceiling. "My dad's been pacing the floor all day. He called me 3 times before 5. "I saw it," Elias said. He sat on the edge of the mattress to take off his socks. The bed dipped under his weight. "He said the city is trying to extort him," Clara said, rolling onto her back. "They're threatening some crazy fine. He thinks the inspector has a personal grudge because of that zoning variance you did last year." Elias paused, one sock half off his foot. He looked down at the carpet. The grudge, Gary suspected, was almost certainly the city simply doing its job. Gary's restaurant, Miller's Tavern, was a local staple, but it was housed in an 80-year-old building that Gary treated with the structural respect of a cardboard box. "I'll look at it," Elias said, his voice flat. "Can you do it tonight?" Clara asked. She turned her head toward him now, her eyes fully open, reflecting the faint ambient light. He's going to call first thing in the morning. He wants to know what he should say if they show up again. You know how he gets. He'll say something stupid and make it worse. An internal scale tipped in Elias's mind. He calculated the remaining hours of the night. It was 11:58 p.m. He had to wake up at 5:30 a.m. to review the final disclosures for the acquisition of a regional logistics company. If he opened Gary's envelope now, he would spend at least 45 minutes researching the Elmridge Municipal Code, cross-referencing ordinances, and drafting a mental script for a man who had never once followed a script in his life. The energy required to say no to Clara, to explain that he had spent 14 hours drafting contracts and that his brain was too tired to parse municipal sewage regulations, was immense. It would lead to a sigh. It would lead to her rolling back over, her shoulder turning into a cold wall, followed by the inevitable, "He's my dad, Elias. He doesn't have anyone else to ask." The emotional friction of her disappointment was more exhausting than the work itself. "Let me take a look," Elias said quietly. He stood up, his joints popping in the quiet room. He walked back to the dresser, picked up the manila envelope, and carried it over to his nightstand. He switched on the small, low-wattage reading lamp on his side of the bed. The amber light cast long, dramatic shadows across the bedsheets. He broke the seal of the envelope. The paper tore with a sharp, dry rasp. Inside was a 3-page document printed on cheap, gray-white recycled paper. The letterhead read, "City of Elmridge, Department of Water and Sewerage." Elias scanned the text, his trained eyes immediately skipping the bureaucratic preamble and locking on to the core terms. Notice of administrative citation and intent to impose civil penalties. The issue was a grease trap, or, more accurately, the complete absence of a functional grease-intercepting system in the commercial kitchen of Miller's Tavern. According to the report, 3 separate inspections over the last 18 months had noted extreme grease discharge entering the municipal main line on 10th Street. Gary had been ordered to install an upgraded 3,000-gallon interceptor. He had ignored the orders, filed 2 extensions, both of which Elias had drafted for him under the guise of informal family advice, and had now reached the absolute end of the city's patience. The fine was $15,000, retroactive to the date of the first inspection notice. Furthermore, the city was threatening an administrative injunction to shut off the tavern's water supply within 10 days if a licensed contractor was not retained to begin the excavation. $15,000. To a corporate entity, it was a rounding error. To Gary Miller, whose profit margins were eaten alive by high food costs and his own chaotic management style, it was a lethal blow. "What does it say?" Clara asked. She had propped herself up on one elbow, her eyes tracking Elias's face as he read. Elias didn't look up from the page. "Your father ignored the compliance window I set up for him in October. He didn't hire the engineer." "Well, he said the engineer wanted $8,000 just for the plans," Clara said, her tone defensive, as if Elias were the one levying the fine. "He couldn't afford that right before the holidays. He thought he had more time." "He didn't have more time," Elias said, his voice dropping into a register of cold, clinical fact. "The extension was very specific, October 15th was the absolute drop-dead date. I told him that. Elias, he didn't understand the legal jargon, Clara said, her voice dropping into that soft, pleading tone that always carried a hint of irritation beneath it. You know how those city documents are. They make them confusing on purpose. Can't you just call the city attorney tomorrow? You know the guy in charge of the department, don't you? Just ask for another extension, or tell them there's a mistake in the paperwork. A mistake in the paperwork. Elias looked at the document. The city's case was airtight. The inspector had attached photographic evidence of the grease buildup in the municipal manhole directly behind the tavern. There was no mistake. There was only Gary's arrogance wrapped in the protective blanket of his son-in-law's free legal services. Elias stared at the paper. He felt the cold, hard weight of a decision forming in his chest. For years he had been the invisible shield, the silent architect of this family's survival, repairing their self-inflicted wounds while they treated his profession like a parlor trick they could summon at will. I'll look at the municipal code in the morning, Elias said. He slid the papers back into the envelope and turned off the reading lamp, plunging the room back into the pale blue shadows of the suburban night. Thanks, Clara whispered, already turning back around, her voice immediately lighter now that the burden had been successfully transferred from her shoulders to his. I knew you'd fix it. Elias lay down in the dark, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to the quiet, mechanical hum of the air conditioner, counting the minutes until he had to get up and do it all again. The vibration of his phone against the nightstand was a low wooden rattle that woke Elias exactly 4 minutes before his 5:30 a.m. alarm was set to go off. In the gray pre-dawn gloom of the bedroom, his hand moved with practiced efficiency. He swiped the screen to silence the call without looking at the caller ID. He didn't need to. The digital clock on the dresser read 5:26. There was only one person who called at this hour on a Tuesday morning, entirely unconcerned with the boundaries of a working household. Gary. Elias sat up, his feet searching for the cold hardwood floor. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, his elbows on his knees, his face buried in his palms. His eyes burned with a dry, sandy grit. 4 hours of sleep. It was a familiar deficit, but today the weight of it felt different. It felt heavy, like wet wool. Behind him, Clara didn't stir. She had pulled the duvet over her shoulder, shielding herself from the draft Elias's departure had created. He walked into the master bathroom and closed the door until the latch clicked shut. He didn't turn on the overhead lights. Instead, he used the soft amber glow of the under-cabinet LED strip. He turned the hot water faucet on, waiting for the steam to rise and fog the glass of the shower door. He took his shaving brush, wet the badger bristles under the steaming stream, and began to work up a lather in his ceramic bowl. The soap smelled of sandalwood and tallow, a heavy traditional scent that always grounded him. He painted his jawline with methodical circular motions. In the mirror, his reflection looked back at him. The skin beneath his eyes was a dull, bruised purple. He was 36, but the deep lines running from his nose to the corners of his mouth belonged to a man 10 years older. He picked up his straight razor. The blade was a wedge of polished German steel. He slid it down his cheek, the sharp sh of the steel cutting through the coarse stubble. This was his 60 seconds of absolute control. The blade required absolute focus. 1 millimeter of deviation, 1 moment of distraction, and the steel would bite. He cleared his mind of Gary, of the grease trap, of the logistics acquisition closing at noon. There was only the angle of the blade, the tension of his skin, and the clean white trail left in the soap. He rinsed his face with freezing water, patted it dry with a stiff Turkish towel, and applied his aftershave. The alcohol stung, a sharp, cold slap that finally forced his eyes wide open. Downstairs, the house was silent and cold. The thermostat had set itself to 65 degrees for the night, and the chill hung in the air of the kitchen. Elias walked to the espresso machine. He went through the motions like a priest performing a liturgy. He measured 18 grams of dark roast beans, poured them into the grinder, and held his breath as the high-pitched whine of the steel burrs shattered the morning quiet. He tamped the grounds into the portafilter with precise 30-pound pressure, locked it into the group head, and pulled the shot. The espresso emerged as a thin, viscous thread of dark amber, folding onto itself in the bottom of the small ceramic cup. The rich, bitter aroma filled the kitchen, pushing back the stale smell of Trent's discarded cereal bowl from the night before, which still sat in the sink, a ring of dried milk hardening around the porcelain rim. Elias set the cup on the island and sat down, opening his iPad. His inbox was already alive. 42 unread emails since midnight. The redrafts of the logistics merger had come in from opposing counsel at 2:14 a.m. At 6:12 a.m., his phone vibrated again. The screen lit up on the counter. Gary Miller. Elias looked at the phone. He took a sip of the espresso. The liquid was hot, bitter, and thick. Under normal circumstances, Elias would have answered on the second ring. He would have listened to Gary's loud, breathy rant about city bureaucrats and corrupt inspectors. He would have calmed him down, promised to make a few calls before his 9 a.m. meeting, and assured him that he would handle the municipal sewer department. Today, Elias did not reach for the phone. He watched the screen illuminate the granite. Gary Miller. The vibration caused the phone to slide a fraction of an inch to the left, towards the edge of the counter. It buzzed 5 times, 6 times, 7 times, then fell silent as the call went to voicemail. 2 minutes later, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message. Gary, Elias, call me as soon as you get this. The city is threatening to shut my water off. I can't run a kitchen without water. This is an emergency. Elias read the text on the lock screen. An emergency. To Gary, an emergency was anything that required him to pay money or take responsibility. To Elias, an emergency was a breach of contract that threatened an $80 million acquisition. He swiped the text away and went back to his red lines on the logistics merger. At 6:45 a.m., the soft patter of bare feet on the stairs announced Clara's descent. She was wearing her oversized fleece bathrobe, her hair tied up in a messy knot. She smelled of sleep and lavender. She walked straight to the coffee maker, her eyes barely open. "Did you make coffee?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Just espresso," Elias said, without looking up from his screen. "But there's hot water in the kettle if you want tea." She sighed, a small, disappointed sound, and pulled a mug from the cabinet. "My dad called me," she said, leaning against the counter, her back to him as she waited for the kettle to heat. "He said you didn't answer." "I was working," Elias said. His finger scrolled through page 14 of the disclosure agreement. "He's really panicking, Elias," she said, her voice rising slightly in pitch. She turned to face him, crossing her arms over her chest. "He said he texted you too. He needs to know what to do. Can't you just give him 5 minutes? It's not like you're in court right now." Elias stopped scrolling. He looked up, his gray eyes settling on his wife. Clara's face was soft, her expression a mix of sleep-deprived irritation and casual expectation. To her, Elias's job was a vague, abstract concept, something he did in a shiny glass tower that paid for their mortgage and her Volvo, but ultimately something that could always be paused, rescheduled, or set aside for her family's convenience. She had never seen him in a high-stakes negotiation. She had never seen him pale and sweating at 3 a.m. over a misplaced comma in a liability clause. To her, he was just the lawyer, the family utility. "My first meeting is at 7:30, Clara," Elias said. His voice was level, entirely devoid of anger, which somehow made it sound colder. "It's a closing. I cannot be late." "I know, but it's just a phone call," she said, her tone softening into that wheedling, persuasive register she used when she wanted to bypass a boundary. "Just tell him what to say to the inspector. 2 minutes, please." Elias looked down at his iPad, then back at his wife. He felt a small, quiet shift occur deep within his chest, a sudden cool drop in temperature. "Tell your father," Elias said, his voice measured and slow, "to read the notice. The instructions on how to request a hearing are on page 3. He needs to follow them exactly." Clara blinked, her mouth opening slightly in surprise. "That's it? You're not going to call the city attorney for him?" "I don't have the file," Elias said, closing his iPad with a soft click, "and I don't represent him." He stood up, picked up his empty espresso cup, and placed it in the sink, directly on top of Trent's dirty cereal bowl. The kettle gave a sharp metallic click as it reached its boiling point, the heating element shutting off with a sudden, heavy drop in the kitchen's white noise. In the silence that followed, Clara stood motionless by the counter, her hands still hovering over her empty mug. "What do you mean you don't represent him?" Her voice was quiet, but it carried a thin, sharp edge of disbelief. She didn't look at Elias. Her eyes were fixed on the granite countertop, tracing the gray veins in the stone, as if looking for a script to read from. Elias stood by the island, his leather briefcase in his right hand. The weight of it was comforting, a physical, tangible reality that made sense. "I mean exactly what I said, Clara. I am a corporate restructuring attorney at a private firm. Your father has a municipal zoning and environmental compliance issue. I am not his counsel of record. I have never been his counsel of record." "That's semantics, Elias, and you know it," Clara said, finally turning to face him. Her hands were shoved deep into the pockets of her fleece robe, her shoulders hunched slightly against the morning chill. "You've always handled his legal stuff. You fixed the deck thing last year. You fixed the tax dispute with the state the year before that. Now suddenly you're not his counsel?" She said the words with a light, mocking cadence, as if counsel were a pretentious word he had invented just to make himself distant. Elias looked at his watch. 7:14 a.m. The pre-closing conference call for the logistics merger was scheduled for 7:30 a.m. He had a 20-minute drive ahead of him, assuming traffic on the interstate wasn't backed up at the river bridge. He felt the familiar calculation running in his head. If he stayed to explain the difference between informal advice and professional liability, he would be late. If he was late, the junior associates would have to run the first 15 minutes of the call, and the client, a notoriously fastidious private equity director, would notice. The cost of explaining his professional boundaries to Clara was a direct hit to his professional reputation. "I have to go," Elias said. He didn't wait for her response. He turned and walked into the mudroom. The mudroom smelled of damp umbrellas and the rubber soles of winter boots. Elias sat on the wooden bench, set his briefcase beside him, and slid his feet into his polished black Oxfords. He picked up his silver shoehorn, sliding it behind his heel. Click. The leather conformed to his foot with a snug, familiar pressure. He tied the laces with 2 quick, precise movements, pulling the knots tight until they lay perfectly flat across the tongue of the shoe. Clara appeared in the doorway of the mudroom. She didn't come inside. She stood on the threshold, her shoulder leaning against the doorframe, her arms crossed. "He's going to lose the tavern, Elias," she said, her voice dropping into a flat, accusing monotone. "If they shut the water off, he can't open for the lunch rush on Friday. He's got 3 employees who rely on those tips. He's going to lose everything because you're too busy with your corporate clients to make a 5-minute phone call." Elias stood up. He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt so they extended exactly half an inch beyond his jacket sleeves. He knew Gary wouldn't lose the tavern by Friday. The municipal utility could not legally terminate water service without a formal hearing and a 10-day post-hearing grace period. The emergency was a fabrication born of Gary's panic and his complete lack of operational foresight. But Clara didn't know that, and Gary certainly didn't care to know it. They preferred the panic. The panic was what they used to force Elias into action. It was their currency. "The city cannot shut off the water on Friday," Elias said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "The administrative code requires 10 days written notice following a formal administrative hearing. If your father files his request for a hearing today, the clock stops." Clara stared at him, her mouth slightly open. "So you're not going to help him file it?" "I told you," Elias said, picking up his briefcase. "The instructions are on page 3. He stepped past her, his shoulder brushing lightly against her sleeve as he navigated the narrow doorway. "Elias!" she called after him, her voice rising in pitch, losing its defensive edge and turning into something closer to genuine anger. "He's my father! How can you be so cold about this?" Elias didn't answer. He walked through the foyer, opened the heavy front door, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The sun was just rising over the tops of the suburban maples, casting long orange bars of light across the damp lawns. The neighborhood was quiet, save for the distant low rumble of a school bus a few blocks over. Elias walked down the brick steps, his leather soles clicking sharply against the concrete path. He unlocked his sedan, set his briefcase on the passenger seat, and climbed in. The interior of the car smelled of rich leather and the clean, sterile scent of a paper air freshener he had placed under the seat 3 weeks ago. He started the engine. The dashboard came to life, the needles sweeping across the dials in a silent electronic greeting. He slid the car into reverse and backed out of the driveway, his eyes tracking the rearview mirror. Through the glass, he could see the front door of his house. It was still open. Clara was standing on the porch, her fleece robe wrapped tightly around her, watching him leave. She looked small against the massive white columns of the colonial-style house. A house that Elias's $750 an hour billing rate paid for in full. He turned the steering wheel, shifting into drive, and the house disappeared from his view. As he reached the end of the street, his phone buzzed in the center console cup holder. He didn't look at it, but the screen flared to life, showing 2 notifications. One was a text from Gary. "Elias, I called the city. The lady was a bitch. She said I need a lawyer to file the appeal. Call me now." The other was from Clara. "I can't believe you're doing this. Please just call him on your way to work. Don't do this to us." Elias reached down, tapped the screen, and set the phone to Do Not Disturb driving mode. The screen went black. The silence in the car was immediate and absolute. He accelerated onto the parkway, the engine humming softly as he merged into the morning rush hour, his hands resting lightly on the leather-wrapped wheel, his eyes fixed on the long gray ribbon of asphalt ahead. The glass-walled office on the 24th floor was quiet, insulated from the city traffic below by triple-paned structural glass. From this height, the cars on the avenue looked like slow-moving beetles, and the people were mere specks against the gray concrete. Here, the world was orderly. It was governed by logic, precedent, and the strict boundaries of contract law. Elias sat at his desk, a massive slab of dark polished walnut that was entirely clear of clutter, save for a single black leather desk pad, a crystal carafe of water, and his silver executive pen. His phone sat face down on the leather pad. Every few minutes, the haptic motor would give a short, muffled bzz, bzz against the leather. It was a soft, persistent, insect-like sound that Elias had trained himself to ignore. "The indemnity cap is set at 15% of the purchase price, Elias," a voice came through the conference room speakerphone. It was Richard Vance, the lead counsel for the logistics conglomerate. His voice was tired, the gravelly tone of a man who had been negotiating since midnight. "Our client isn't going any higher. We feel that's more than reasonable, given the historical audit reports." Elias leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on the cool walnut. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The audit reports from 2 years ago didn't account for the new environmental regulations on fuel storage, Richard. If we close today at 15%, my client carries the entire risk of the EPA retrofitting costs. We need 25, or we walk. A long silence stretched over the phone line. Elias could hear the faint rustle of papers on the other end, the quiet murmur of Vance consulting with his associate. Elias didn't fidget. He didn't look at his watch. He waited, his breathing steady, his body perfectly still. He was comfortable in the silence. He had learned early in his career that the person who spoke first in a negotiation usually lost. 20, Vance said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "We'll agree to a 20% cap, but only if the escrow release is moved up to 12 months. 18 months, Elias countered instantly. And we have a deal. Another pause. Agreed. We'll send over the revised schedule by 11. Thank you, Richard, Elias said, and tapped the screen to end the call. He leaned back in his ergonomic leather chair, the tension in his shoulders releasing slightly. That 3-minute exchange had just secured $500,000 in risk mitigation for his client. It was clean, it was professional. The client would receive the bill, pay it without question, and send a bottle of high-end scotch to the office as a token of appreciation. Elias reached out and turned his phone over. There were 11 missed calls, 9 from Gary, 2 from Clara. There were also 6 text messages. He tapped the screen to open them. Gary, 9:14 a.m. Elias, I went to the water department. The clerk is an idiot. She told me the hearing request has to be notarized. What does that even mean? Where do I get a notary? Gary, 9:42 a.m. Elias, answer your damn phone. This is my livelihood we're talking about. Gary, 10:15 a.m. Can you just have your secretary fill this out and notary it? I can drop the papers off at your office. I'm right down the street at the wholesale market. Elias stared at the last message. Have your secretary fill this out and notary it. His administrative assistant, Sarah, was a highly skilled professional with a degree in legal studies who made $85,000 a year coordinating multi-million-dollar corporate closings. Gary viewed her as a personal clerk, an extension of the free legal service he felt entitled to by virtue of his daughter's marriage. He wanted Sarah to commit a misdemeanor by notarizing a document she had not witnessed Gary sign, simply because Gary couldn't be bothered to find a bank or a shipping store. The sheer casual audacity of it was breathtaking. It was the weaponized incompetence that had defined Elias's relationship with the Miller family for 7 years. They didn't want to learn how the world worked. They wanted Elias to carry them through it, like children carried through a muddy field, complaining the entire time that his shoulders weren't comfortable enough. Elias tapped on Clara's messages next. Clara, 10:30 a.m. Elias, my dad is losing his mind. He called me from his car and he was screaming. He said you're ignoring him. Why are you being like this today? It's one phone call. Just help him with the notary thing so he can calm down. Clara, 11:02 a.m. Are you seriously not answering me either? I know you're not in court all day. Please call me. Elias looked at the blinking cursor in the text field. The familiar heavy pressure in his chest returned. In the past, this was the moment he would have capitulated. He would have sent a quick, apologetic text to Clara. He would have told Sarah to handle Gary's paperwork. Or he would have run down to the lobby himself to meet Gary, take the document, and find a notary in the building to sign off on it, just to keep the peace. He would have spent his own lunch hour fixing a problem Gary had created through 18 months of sheer, stubborn negligence. He looked at his crystal water carafe. He poured a glass, watching the clear water fill the heavy tumbler. Why are you being like this today? To Clara, his boundaries were a behavioral anomaly, a mood, a bad day. She didn't see his sudden refusal to work for free as a permanent shift. She saw it as a temporary tantrum that could be resolved with enough persistent nagging and guilt. They had treated his labor like water from a tap for so long that they genuinely believed the tap was broken, not that he had simply decided to turn the valve. Elias picked up his silver pen. He clicked the top. Click, click. He typed a single brief reply to Clara. Elias, I am in the middle of a closing. I cannot assist your father with his administrative paperwork. He can find a notary public at any local branch of his bank or a post office. He hit send. He did not reply to Gary. He did not call him. He set the phone face down on the leather pad once more, stood up, and adjusted his tie. He picked up the finalized logistics merger agreement, tucked it under his arm, and walked out of his office toward the main conference room, leaving the silent, vibrating phone behind on his desk. The garage door rumbled shut behind Elias's sedan with a heavy mechanical thud that reverberated through the frame of the house. He sat in the driver's seat for a full minute, his hands resting on the steering wheel, waiting for the echo of the door to die down. The dashboard display faded to black, leaving him in the dim yellow light of the garage's overhead bulb. On the passenger seat lay his briefcase, its leather slightly scuffed on the corner from the metal edge of the office elevator. Elias grabbed his briefcase, opened the car door, and stepped out into the humid air of the garage. When he opened the door leading into the kitchen, he was met with a wall of heavy, silent tension. The house smelled of garlic-heavy grease and cardboard, the distinct scent of cheap commercial pizza from the delivery place down the street. It was a stark departure from the meals Clara usually prepared or ordered when they were on good terms. On the kitchen island sat a half-open cardboard pizza box, its lid bent backward. A dark, translucent circle of grease had already soaked through the bottom of the box, pooling directly onto the polished granite counter. Clara was sitting at the far end of the living room sofa. The television was on, muted, casting flickering blue and violet shadows across her face. She was holding her phone, her thumb flicking rapidly across the screen, her expression frozen in a tight, pinched scowl. She did not look up when he walked in. She did not say a word. Elias set his briefcase down on the far end of the counter, far away from the grease circle. He walked over to the sink, pulled a sheet of paper towel from the roll, and ran it under the cold water faucet. He walked back to the island, lifted the greasy pizza box with one hand, and methodically wiped the oil from the granite. He worked in slow, concentric circles until the stone was clean, then dried it with a fresh sheet. He did it without rushing, focusing entirely on the physical feedback of the paper towel sliding over the smooth granite. He discarded the paper towels in the trash can beneath the sink. The soft click of the cabinet door closing was the only sound in the room. "My dad had to pay $150 to a mobile notary," Clara said. Her voice was flat, devoid of its usual warmth, coming from the dimness of the living room, like a stone thrown into a quiet pond. She still hadn't looked at him. Her eyes remained glued to her phone, though her thumb had stopped moving. Elias walked over to the refrigerator. He opened it, retrieved a pitcher of filtered water, and poured himself a glass. The water was crisp and cold, a sharp contrast to the stale, greasy air of the kitchen. "I'm glad he was able to find one," Elias said. His tone was polite, professional, and entirely neutral. Clara let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound that was more of a scoff. She finally tossed her phone onto the sofa cushion next to her and sat up straight, her arms tightly crossed over her chest. "He shouldn't have had to pay that, Elias," she said, her voice rising slightly. He's 64 years old. He has high blood pressure, and he spent his entire morning driving around the city in a panic because you wouldn't take his calls. $150 is a lot of money to him right now." Elias leaned his lower back against the kitchen counter, holding his glass of water in both hands. He looked at his wife. In the flickering blue light of the muted television, she looked tired, but her fatigue was wrapped in a protective layer of self-righteous indignation. She truly believed Elias was the antagonist in this scenario. She believed his refusal to work on his father-in-law's administrative mess was a personal assault on her family. "A mobile notary is a standard convenience service, Clara," Elias said quietly. "It saved him a trip to the bank." "He wouldn't have needed a convenience service if you had just spent 5 minutes looking at the paper," she shot back, her voice tightening. "You've done it 100 times before. You always help him. Now suddenly you're acting like his problems are beneath you? Is that what this is? You've got your big partner meetings now, so my family is just a chore?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. In the past, this was where Elias would have felt the familiar, uncomfortable pang of guilt. He would have stepped into the living room, sat on the edge of the sofa, and tried to explain his exhaustion. He would have apologized for his tone, validated her feelings, and promised to handle the next step of Gary's appeal for free to make up for it. He would have spent his emotional reserves to purchase her comfort. But tonight, Elias felt nothing. The emotional reservoir was dry. He looked at her, and all he saw was a series of bad habits he had allowed them to form. "My billable rate is $750 an hour, Clara," Elias said, his voice steady, dropping the words into the quiet room like heavy lead weights. "At that rate, the 45 minutes I spent on Sunday redlining Trent's commercial lease was worth over $500. The 3 hours I spent last year on your father's zoning variance was worth over $2,000. $150 for a notary is an incredibly reasonable cost for your father to bear to resolve his own administrative negligence." Clara stared at him, her eyes widening in a mixture of shock and disgust. She sat up even straighter, her jaw dropping slightly. "You're billing my family now?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Is that what we are to you? A line item? A billable hour?" "No," Elias said. He took a slow sip of his water, feeling the cold liquid slide down his throat. "If you were clients, I would have sent an engagement letter and collected a retainer before opening the file. You are family, which is why I have done thousands of dollars of highly specialized legal labor for you for free, without complaint, for 7 years. "We're family, Elias!" Clara raised her voice, her face flushing red in the dim light. "We don't keep score. We don't charge each other for help." "You don't charge me," Elias corrected her softly, "because you don't provide a professional service that I require. But you certainly keep score of my availability." The silence returned, thicker this time, suffocating the space between the kitchen and the living room. Clara stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She looked at him as if he were a stranger, a dangerous, unpredictable element that had suddenly appeared in her home. She didn't have an answer. The casual entitlement of her position had been stripped of its polite language, leaving her with nothing but her anger. She snatched her phone off the sofa cushion, stood up, and walked toward the stairs. She didn't look at him as she passed. Her slippers slapped against the hardwood floor, a rapid, angry rhythm that faded as she reached the carpeted stairs. Elias stood alone in the kitchen. The refrigerator compressor kicked on with its familiar low vibration, a steady hum that filled the empty space. He looked at the half-eaten pizza box on the counter, then down at his glass of water. He didn't feel guilty. He didn't feel angry. He felt only the quiet, cool clarity of a ledger that was finally beginning to balance. The night had passed in a series of long, shallow drafts of cold air. Elias had slept on his side of the king-size bed, his body aligned with the outer edge of the mattress, leaving a vast, untouched expanse of white linen between himself and Clara. Neither of them had reached across the divide. When Clara had finally come up to bed, she had climbed in silently, turning her back to him instantly, her posture rigid beneath the blankets. By 5 a.m. on Wednesday, the room was a quiet gray. Elias slid out from under the duvet without making a sound. He dressed in the dark of his closet, selecting a slate gray wool suit and a crisp white Egyptian cotton shirt. The collar was stiff, pressing against his throat as he fastened the top button. He chose a dark blue tie, unremarkable, professional, a uniform for a man who needed to disappear into his work. Downstairs, the kitchen was still wrapped in the heavy, cold quiet of early morning. The smell of the greasy pizza from the night before had finally faded, replaced by the damp, earthy scent of the garden outside the window, where a light morning dew had settled over the hydrangeas. Elias walked to the pantry to grab a box of loose-leaf black tea. As he opened the pantry door, his sleeve brushed against the monthly calendar hanging from a small bronze hook. The calendar was a physical ledger of their social obligations, written in Clara's neat, rounded print. Elias paused, his hand resting on the pantry door, and looked at the grid for the week. Thursday, June 11th. Dinner at Dad's, 7 p.m. Tomorrow night. Elias stared at the ink. Dinner at Dad's. It was a bi-weekly ritual. Under normal circumstances, Elias would have spent the preceding days mentally preparing for it. He would have known that Gary would corner him by the grill, a beer in one hand and a stack of unorganized documents in the other, asking for just a quick opinion on a tax notice or a employee dispute. Trent would be there, bragging about a new business venture while asking Elias to look over a contract that was actually a binding legal trap. And Clara would watch from the kitchen island, smiling, relieved that her husband was keeping her chaotic family afloat. Elias calculated the energy it would take to attend tomorrow's dinner versus the energy it would take to decline. If he declined, it would trigger a massive emotional cascade. Clara would accuse him of punishing her family. Gary would claim Elias was too proud to eat at his table. Trent would complain that Elias was sabotaging his business out of spite. The volume of noise would be deafening. But if he went, he could sit there in silence. He could watch the gears of their entitlement grind against the new, cold reality of his boundaries. He would be present physically, but entirely absent as a resource. The thought brought a strange, cool calmness to his chest. It was the gather of quiet power. He would go. His phone gave a soft, single vibration in his hand. He looked down at the screen. It was a text from Trent, sent at 12:44 a.m., long after Elias had gone to sleep. Trent, landlord rejected the escrow holdback. Says he wants a personal guarantee from my dad to sign the lease. I need you to draft up a quick guarantee form so we can get this done today. Landlord's lawyer said, if we don't have it by 5 p.m., he's giving the space to a coffee shop. Text me back. Elias looked at the text. He walked over to the kettle, filled it with water, and set it on the stove, turning the gas burner on. The blue flame hissed to life, licking the metal bottom of the kettle. To draft a personal guarantee for Gary to sign on behalf of Trent's LLC was not a quick form. It was a binding legal instrument that would make Gary personally, infinitely liable for Trent's commercial rent, triple net fees, and structural damages for the next 5 years. If Trent's vapor shop failed, which statistically and operationally it was almost guaranteed to do within the first 12 months, the landlord would bypass Trent entirely and sue Gary for every penny. Gary would lose the tavern. He would lose his house. And Trent wanted Elias to draft this instrument. Elias sat at the kitchen island, his iPad open to his firm's internal portal. He pulled up his personal email and typed a reply to Trent. Trent, I cannot draft a personal guarantee for your father. Advising both you as the tenant and your father as the guarantor represents a direct conflict of interest under the rules of professional conduct. Furthermore, I cannot recommend that anyone execute a personal guarantee for a commercial lease of this nature. You will need to retain independent counsel if you wish to proceed. He hit send. It was clean, it was professional, it was a shield forged from the exact rules of the profession they so casually dismissed. The kettle began to whistle, a low, rising tone that vibrated through the quiet kitchen. Elias turned off the gas, poured the boiling water over the tea leaves in his cast-iron pot, and waited for it to steep. The soft scuff of slippers on the stairs broke the silence. Clara walked into the kitchen. She was still in her bathrobe, her face pale, and her eyes slightly swollen from sleep, or the lack of it. She didn't look at Elias. She walked straight to the sink, picked up a single ceramic spoon that had been left in the basin, and began to rinse it under the tap with intense, focused energy. The water splashed against the porcelain, the sound loud and chaotic in the quiet room. "Are we still going to my dad's tomorrow?" she asked. Her voice was tight, directed at the window above the sink rather than at him. "Yes," Elias said, pouring his tea into a travel mug. "Are you going to be like this tomorrow, too?" She turned off the faucet with a sharp, wrenching motion. She finally turned to look at him, her arms crossed tightly, her chin tilted upward in defensive challenge. "Like what, Clara?" Elias asked. He looked at her calmly, his face a smooth, unreadable mask. "Like a robot," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Cold, calculating, counting your billable hours like we're strangers. He's my father, Elias. He's hosting us. If you're just going to sit there and judge everyone, maybe you shouldn't come." Elias picked up his travel mug and secured the lid. He stood up, smoothing the front of his slate gray suit jacket. "Your father invited us for dinner, Clara," Elias said, his voice quiet and level. "I look forward to the meal." He picked up his briefcase, walked past her without another word, and stepped out into the gray morning light, leaving her alone in the kitchen with the cold tea leaves and the clean, empty spoon. The sun was sinking below the western skyline, painting the office tower's glass panels in a bruised violet hue. In the quiet of his office, Elias sat at his desk, watching the dust motes drift through the narrow shaft of light that managed to squeeze between the high-rises. He was wrapping up his billing ledger for the day. 1.2 hours, redrafting asset purchase agreement. 0.8 hours, client consultation. 2.4 hours, reviewing environmental disclosure schedules. Every block of his life was categorized, quantified, and assigned a direct economic value. He picked up his personal phone. It had been on silent since lunch. There was a string of notifications waiting for him. The first was from Trent, sent at 2:15 p.m. Trent, are you serious? A conflict of interest? He's my dad, not a stranger. You're just trying to block me from getting this space. If I lose this shop because you won't write a simple one-page form, that's on you. Real family helps each other. The second was from Gary, sent at 3:30 p.m. Gary, Elias, Trent said you refused to do the guarantee paper. It's just a standard form. I told him I'm willing to sign it to help him get started. Why are you making this so difficult? I've got enough stress with the city water people breathing down my neck. Call me back as soon as you can. Elias stared at the screen. The phrases simple one-page form and standard form practically vibrated with their ignorance. To them, a contract wasn't a binding web of liabilities. It was a magical incantation that Elias was refusing to whisper on their behalf. They had no conception of the ruin they were casually inviting into their lives. He locked the screen. The glass went dark, reflecting his own calm, unperturbed face. He felt no urge to reply. He felt no burning need to write a 3-page essay explaining the sheer financial suicide of a personal guarantee, or the strict ethical codes of the State Bar Association regarding dual representation. He had given his answer. It was complete. It was final. He packed his briefcase, checking to ensure his laptop and the physical closing binders for Friday were secure. He slid his fountain pen into his vest pocket, turned off his office lamp, and stepped out into the quiet hallway. The drive home was an exercise in absolute isolation. Elias turned off the radio. The only sound was the low, steady rush of wind against the windshield and the rhythmic thrum of the tires over the expansion joints of the highway. The sky transitioned from violet to a deep ink black. When he pulled into the driveway, the house was dark, save for the single porch light and the glow from the second-story master bedroom window. He entered through the front door, the deadbolt clicking shut behind him. The house was cold. The thermostat had been lowered to 64 degrees again, a silent physical manifestation of Clara's displeasure. The air smelled faintly of bleach and pine cleaner. Clara had spent the day cleaning, a physical outlet she always turned to when she was simmering with unresolved anger. From the top of the stairs, Elias heard the low, rapid murmur of a voice. He stood in the foyer, his hands still resting on the brass coat rack, and listened. The wood floorboards overhead acted as a speaker box, carrying the muffled cadence of Clara's voice down to the entryway. "No, Dad, I know," she was saying, her tone a mix of exhaustion and defensive loyalty. "I tried talking to him this morning before he left. I don't know what's wrong with him lately. He's being completely cold about the whole thing. He literally quoted his hourly rate to me last night. Yes, he's still coming tomorrow. I told him we're going. No, don't say anything to him yet. Let me try to get through to him tonight. A pause. Then, I know, Dad. I know Trent is stressed. Just tell him to hold off on the landlord. Elias will. I'll make sure we figure something out. Elias hung his wool coat on the rack. The hanger slid across the wooden pole with a dry, scraping sound. The voice upstairs abruptly stopped. A moment later, the soft patter of Clara's slippers sounded on the upstairs carpet, followed by her silhouette appearing at the top of the landing. She was holding a half-empty glass of white wine. The condensation on the glass had run down her fingers, leaving wet, dark spots on the sleeve of her gray knit sweater. She looked down at him, her eyes shadowed, her face set in a hard, defensive line. She didn't offer a greeting. "There's chicken salad in the fridge," she said, her voice dropping into the cold, flat register she had adopted since Tuesday night. "I'm not hungry." "Thank you," Elias said. He walked into the kitchen, set his briefcase on the counter, and poured himself a glass of water from the carafe. He didn't touch the chicken salad. Clara came down the stairs slowly, her hands sliding along the oak banister. She walked into the kitchen, taking a slow sip of her wine, her eyes tracking his every movement. She was waiting for him to bring it up. She was waiting for him to complain about the texts, or to defend his refusal to help Trent, or to ask why she was talking about him to her father behind his back. She wanted the confrontation. She wanted the heat of an argument, because an argument meant he still cared enough to engage. Elias simply stood by the counter, holding his water glass, his expression perfectly serene. He looked at her with the polite, distant interest of a passerby on the street. "My dad is really hurt, Elias," she said, the silence finally becoming too heavy for her to bear. She set her wine glass on the island with a sharp clink. "I'm sorry to hear that," Elias replied. His voice was smooth, even, and entirely devoid of sarcasm. It was the voice he used when delivering bad news to opposing counsel, polite, unyielding, and completely detached from the outcome. "He thinks you don't care about this family anymore," she said, her voice trembling slightly, her eyes searching his face for any sign of a crack. "He thinks you're looking down on us." Elias took a slow sip of his water. He looked at the wet ring her wineglass had left on the granite counter, but he didn't wipe it up this time. He let it sit. "I have a long day tomorrow, Clara," Elias said softly, setting his glass down. "I'm going to go read in the study." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing alone in the dim light, her half-empty glass of wine slowly dripping condensation onto the polished stone. The rain had started sometime around 3 a.m., a steady, rhythmic drumming against the window pane of the study. Elias had spent the second half of the night on the leather Chesterfield sofa in his office, his long frame slightly cramped, but his mind perfectly still. He preferred the firm, unyielding leather of the sofa to the soft, silent accusation of the master bed. The study smelled of dry paper, old leather bindings, and the faint, sweet scent of cedarwood from the built-in bookshelves. It was a space he had paid for, designed, and maintained. It was the only room in the house that Clara never cleaned and Trent never entered. By 6 a.m., the rain had slowed to a gray, misty drizzle that clung to the window glass in tiny, trembling beads. Elias stood before the small mirror in the guest bathroom, adjusting a silver tie bar. He aligned it precisely between the third and fourth buttons of his white dress shirt. His movements were slow, clean, and practiced. He felt a deep physical exhaustion in his limbs, but his mind was sharp, operating with the cold diagnostic efficiency of a machine. He gathered his leather briefcase and walked down to the kitchen. To his surprise, the kitchen was already lit, the warm yellow light of the under-cabinet LEDs reflecting off the polished granite island. Clara was standing by the stove, her back to him, holding a ceramic mug. The rich, slightly burnt aroma of drip coffee filled the air. On the counter sat a second mug, steam rising slowly from its dark surface. Elias paused at the threshold of the kitchen. He calculated the gesture. This was a classic tactical shift in the silent warfare of their marriage. When anger, passive aggression, and guilt failed to elicit an apology, Clara would transition to a quiet domestic peace offering. It was designed to make him feel comfortable, to lower his guard so that they could return to the status quo, where he was useful and she was satisfied. "I made coffee," she said quietly. She didn't turn around, but her shoulders dropped slightly, a physical cue that she was waiting for his reaction. "Thank you," Elias said. He walked over to the counter, picked up the mug, and took a sip. It was drip coffee, lacking the rich, velvety crema of his espresso, and she had added a splash of milk, something he never did. It was a small detail, a minor ignorance of his preferences after 7 years of marriage, but he drank it anyway. The metabolic cost of pointing out the mistake was too high. He chose the silence of compliance. Clara turned around, leaning her hip against the edge of the sink. She looked pale in the gray morning light, the dark circles under her eyes mirroring his own. Her face had lost its hard, defensive edge from the night before, replaced by a soft, almost pleading exhaustion. "Are you still coming tonight?" she asked. Her voice was low, lacking the sharp hostility of their previous exchanges. "If you're too busy, or if you're still angry, I can tell my dad you had a late closing. I can make an excuse for you." Elias set the mug down on the counter. The ceramic made a dull, soft sound against the stone. He recognized the offer for what it was, a trap. If he accepted the excuse, he would be the one who boycotted the family dinner. He would be the one holding a grudge, the selfish son-in-law who couldn't put aside his work for a family meal. She would have the moral high ground, and she would use it to slowly grind down his boundaries over the coming weeks. "I will be there," Elias said, his voice calm and even. "I'll drive straight from the office after my 5 o'clock meeting." Clara let out a slow, quiet breath. She looked down at her own mug, her finger tracing the circular rim. "Okay, good. My dad is doing steaks. He bought the expensive ones from the butcher on Main Street." "I'm sure they will be excellent," Elias said. "Please, Elias," she whispered, her eyes flickering up to meet his. "Let's just have a normal night. No talk about bills or legal stuff or hourly rates. Just a nice family dinner. Can we do that?" Elias looked at his wife. He saw the desperation in her face, the desire to patch over the structural cracks in their life with a thin layer of social politeness. She wanted the illusion of peace, the comfort of believing that her family's exploitation of him was just a minor friction they could eat their way through with a good steak. "I have no intention of discussing my work tonight, Clara," Elias said. It was the absolute truth. He had no intention of discussing anything of substance. He was going to the dinner as an observer, not a participant. He was going to watch them navigate the first major crisis of their own making without his invisible hand to guide them. "Thank you," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She looked genuinely relieved, her shoulders relaxing fully for the first time in days. "I'll see you there around 7?" "7," Elias confirmed. He picked up his briefcase, took one last sip of the lukewarm, milky coffee, and walked out of the house. As he stepped onto the wet porch, the cool, damp air hit his face, washing away the heavy, suffocating scent of the kitchen. He unlocked his car, climbed into the quiet cabin, and started the engine, his mind already shifting to the final documents for Friday's closing. The stage was set. The gravel in Gary's driveway crunched beneath Elias's tires, a sharp, grinding sound that signaled his arrival at the split-level ranch house. Gary's home was a monument to deferred maintenance. The gutters were choked with dry maple keys, the front lawn was a patchy mix of crabgrass and clover, and Gary's aging pickup truck was parked half on, half off the grass, its rusted tailgate lowered. Trent's battered hatchback was parked at an angle near the garage, blocking the walkway. Elias turned off his engine. The sudden silence in the car cabin was heavy. Through the windshield, he could see a thin column of white, greasy smoke rising from behind the wooden privacy fence of the backyard. The smell of lighter fluid and cheap charcoal drifted through his open car window, thick and chemically sweet. Elias sat still. He looked down at his clothes. He had kept his white dress shirt and dark gray suit trousers on, but he had removed his jacket and tie, rolling his sleeves up exactly 2 turns to his mid-forearm. It was a calculated compromise, unbuttoned enough to signal compliance with the family dinner, but structured enough to maintain a clear line of professional distance. He opened the car door and stepped out into the humid, heavy air of the June evening. As he rounded the corner of the wooden fence, the tinny sound of classic rock music drifted from a portable Bluetooth speaker resting on a plastic patio table. Gary was standing by a black kettle grill, a metal spatula in his right hand, and a sweat-beaded can of beer in his left. He was wearing a faded polo shirt that stretched tight over his beer gut, and his face was flushed red from the heat of the coals. Clara was already there, sitting on a weathered canvas lawn chair. She was holding a fresh glass of white wine, her fingers nervously tracing the stem. When she saw Elias, her posture visibly stiffened, but she forced a quick, fragile smile that didn't reach her eyes. Trent was slumped in a folding chair next to her, his legs splayed out, his thumb flying across the screen of his phone. He didn't look up. "Elias, the man of the hour!" Gary shouted over the music. He gestured with his spatula, waving a plume of gray smoke toward Elias. "Look who made it out of the ivory tower! Get this man a cold one, Clara." Clara stood up quickly, almost too quickly, and reached into a red plastic cooler overflowing with melting ice. She pulled out a green bottle of domestic lager, the glass dripping with freezing water, and handed it to Elias. "Hey," she murmured, her eyes searching his face for a split second before she looked down at the grass. "Thank you, Clara," Elias said. He took the bottle. The glass was shot cold against his palm. He held it loosely by the neck, his internal calculation already complete. He would hold the bottle, bring it to his lips occasionally, but he would not drink. Alcohol dulled the reflexes. Tonight he needed his reflexes to be razor sharp. "Steaks are just about done," Gary said, scraping the cast-iron grate of the grill with a wire brush. "Screech! Screech!" The sound was physical, setting Elias's teeth on edge. "Good ribeyes, thick cut, none of that grass-fed organic garbage, real beef." "Sounds wonderful, Gary," Elias said, his voice smooth and neutral. He walked over to the edge of the wooden deck and leaned his lower back against the railing, placing himself physically outside the circle of the lawn chairs. "Yeah, well, we gotta eat good while we can," Gary said, his tone shifting slightly, dropping into a low, gravelly register that carried a performative sigh. "Before the city bureaucrats shut me down and take my water." The comment was a probe. It was thrown out into the humid air like a fishing lure, designed to drag Elias into a discussion about the administrative citation. Elias did not bite. He stood perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask of polite interest. He took a tiny, microscopic sip of his beer, letting the cold liquid sit on his tongue before swallowing. "The weather held up nicely for the grill," Elias remarked, looking up at the gray, overcast sky. Gary paused, his spatula hovering over a sizzling ribeye. He blinked, clearly caught off guard by the complete pivot. He shot a quick, questioning glance at Clara, who immediately looked away, taking a long, deep gulp of her wine. Trent let out a loud, wet snort from his lawn chair, his eyes still fixed on his phone screen. "Yeah, great weather. Perfect for a funeral." "Trent!" Clara snapped, her voice sharp with warning. "What?" Trent muttered, finally looking up, his face twisted in a sneer directed straight at Elias. "I'm just saying, some of us are actually trying to build a business here, but we can't get any help because some people think they're too good for family." The truce, barely 10 minutes old, was already fraying at the edges. Elias looked at Trent. He didn't feel anger. He felt only the calm, clinical detachment of a doctor examining a reflex. Trent was 24, living in a cheap apartment paid for partially by Gary, trying to open a business with no business plan, and his immediate reaction to being denied a dangerous legal instrument was a petulant, childish tantrum. Elias didn't defend himself. He didn't explain the rules of professional conduct. He simply met Trent's hostile gaze with a cool, steady stare that lasted exactly 3 seconds too long. Trent's eyes flickered, his bravado faltering under the weight of Elias's absolute silence. He muttered something under his breath and looked back down at his phone. All right, Gary said, his voice strained as he began flipping the steaks, the fat rendering and flare-ups of orange flame illuminating his sweaty face. "Let's get the food inside. It's too damn humid out here anyway. Come on, help me with the platters, Clara." As Clara walked past Elias to go into the kitchen, she paused for a fraction of a second. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioner unit on the side of the house. Elias didn't answer. He followed her inside, his fingers wrapped tightly around the cold, untouched beer bottle, ready for the dining room table where the true negotiation would begin. The dining room of Gary's split-level ranch was illuminated by a brass chandelier that hung too low over the laminate table. 2 of its 5 frosted glass bulbs were dead, casting the room in a lopsided yellow-orange shadow. The window air conditioning unit hummed a loud, vibrating drone, occasionally rattling the window pane when the compressor struggled against the sticky June heat outside. They sat on high-backed, vinyl-padded chairs that stuck to the skin if one leaned back too long. The steaks sat in the center of the table on a large, floral, ceramic platter. Gary had sliced them quickly, and a dark, bloody pool of juices had accumulated at the bottom of the dish, slowly congealing as the cool air from the window unit blew over it. Beside the meat was a bowl of instant mashed potatoes, already forming a thin, translucent skin on top, and a bag of store-bought dinner rolls. Elias had been given a thin paper plate. It sagged slightly under the weight of the thick ribeye Gary had slapped onto it. Elias used his plastic-handled steak knife to cut a small, neat square from the edge of his steak. The knife was dull, its cheap serrations tearing at the gray, overcooked fibers of the meat rather than slicing through them. He chewed slowly, methodically. The steak was heavily salted, charred on the outside but tough in the middle, tasting faintly of the lighter fluid Gary had used to start the coals. "So, Elias," Gary said, his mouth half full of dinner roll. He wiped a smear of butter from his gray-flecked mustache with the back of his hand. "Still working 80 hours a week in that glass tower?" "The hours vary depending on the active transactions," Elias replied, his voice level, pitched perfectly to slide beneath the drone of the air conditioner.
"I don't know how you do it, honestly," Gary said, shaking his head. He took a heavy gulp of his beer, the glass clinking sharply against his wedding ring. "Life's too short, man. When I was your age, I'd pull my 35 hours at the machine shop, and by Friday at noon, I was hitching the boat to the truck. We'd be out on the reservoir before the sun even started to go down. You guys nowadays, you're just wage slaves in fancy suits. You're missing the whole point of being young." "Elias has a lot of responsibility, Dad," Clara said. She was picking at her mashed potatoes, her fork making a soft, scraping sound against her plate. Her tone was defensive, but there was a subtle, hollow note to it, a familiar, underlying resentment that Elias had heard many times before. "His firm expects him to be available. It's just how the industry is." "Yeah, well, the industry sounds like a scam," Trent chimed in. He had piled his plate high with potatoes, a massive crater of gravy in the center. He didn't use a knife. He simply used the edge of his fork to hack off chunks of steak, shoving them into his mouth with his head lowered close to the table. "You work 90 hours a week so some old guys at the top can buy a third yacht. Meanwhile, you don't even have time to help your own family with a simple piece of paper." The table went instantly quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioner. Clara stopped her fork mid-scrape. She shot a quick, nervous glance at Elias, then at her brother. "Trent, don't," she muttered. "What?" Trent said, looking up, his cheeks bulging as he chewed. "It's true. He's a big-shot lawyer. He can write a contract in his sleep. But when his own brother-in-law needs a hand to start a business, suddenly it's a conflict of interest. It's pathetic, man. It's like you're looking for excuses not to help." Elias did not look up from his plate. He carefully sliced another small piece of meat. The metabolic calculation was instantaneous. To explain the concept of professional liability, the risk of disbarment, or the absolute financial ruin a personal guarantee would bring to Gary, would require an immense expenditure of energy. It would require them to possess a capacity for self-reflection that they had never once demonstrated. They didn't want to understand. They wanted to complain. They wanted to frame Elias's boundaries as a moral failure on his part, so they could feel justified in their anger. So Elias chose silence. He took a bite of the tough steak, chewed it 30 times, and swallowed. He let Trent's words hang in the air, unrefuted, like a heavy draft of cold air. Gary watched Elias, his eyes narrowing slightly at the lack of reaction. The silence was clearly making him uncomfortable. He cleared his throat,
leaning his heavy forearms on the edge of the table. "Look, Elias," Gary said, his tone softening into a performative, fatherly warmth that Elias recognized instantly. It was the tone Gary used when he was about to ask for a loan he had no intention of repaying. "Trent's just frustrated. He's excited about this shop. It's a big opportunity for him. And frankly, I'm willing to take the risk on the guarantee. I'm his father. That's what fathers do. I just need you to put it in legal terms so the landlord's lawyer doesn't screw us. It's family, Elias. We gotta stick together." Elias set his plastic knife and fork down. He aligned them perfectly parallel on the right side of his sagging paper plate. He looked at Gary, his gray eyes steady and entirely devoid of emotion. "I gave Trent my legal assessment of the transaction yesterday," Elias said, his voice quiet, calm, and completely flat. "I have nothing further to add to the matter." Gary's face flushed a deeper shade of red. The performative warmth vanished instantly, replaced by a hard, stubborn, defensive flare. He slammed his beer can down on the table. The laminate surface rattled, and a few drops of foam spilled over the aluminum rim. "Your legal assessment?" Gary scoffed, his voice rising over the air conditioner's hum. "Elias, I didn't ask for an assessment. I asked for a favor. There's a difference." "And I declined to perform it," Elias said. The simplicity of the statement was devastating. It offered no room for negotiation, no emotional hook for Gary to latch onto, no apology for Clara to soften. It was a solid, concrete wall. Clara stared at her plate, her fingers gripping her wineglass so tightly her knuckles were white. The silence in the dining room grew so dense it felt as though the air pressure had dropped, leaving them all struggling to breathe in the yellow-orange light. The hum of the window air conditioner seemed to drop an octave, filling the small dining room with a thick, vibrating bass note. "Declined," Gary repeated, the word coming out wet and heavy. He stared at Elias, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his jaw set in a hard, stubborn line. "You declined, just like that, like we're some random bums off the street asking for a handout. Do you have any idea how that sounds, Elias? After everything this family has done for you?" Elias sat perfectly still, his spine aligned with the rigid back of his vinyl chair. In his mind, a quiet diagnostic process ran. Everything this family has done for you. He searched his memory, searching for a single instance of reciprocal support, a single time Gary or Trent had offered anything of value. There was the time Gary had lent him a rusted post-hole digger 3 years ago, which Elias had returned cleaned and oiled the next afternoon. There were the family dinners, of course, where Elias was routinely expected to pay for the groceries or bring expensive wine that Gary would drink straight from the bottle. The exchange rate of their help was heavily inflated. They treated their minimal, basic hospitality as an infinite credit line, while treating his highly specialized, high-liability professional labor as a free, natural resource. "I told you, Dad," Trent said, tossing his plastic fork onto his plate. It bounced with a dull, grease-muffled clack. "He's a robot. He doesn't have actual feelings. He's got spreadsheets where his brain is supposed to be. Honestly, Clara, I still don't know how you stand living with this guy. You used to actually laugh. You used to be fun." Clara did not defend him. She sat with her head lowered, her wineglass held close to her chest like a shield. She didn't look at Elias. Her silence was heavy, a passive-aggressive endorsement of her brother's words. She was angry. Angry that Elias had embarrassed her by not complying. Angry that he had forced her to witness this conflict. "Man, that's the truth," Gary muttered, leaning back in his sticky vinyl chair. The plastic groaned under his weight. He took a heavy, wet gulp of his beer, his eyes tracking Elias's face for any sign of a crack. "You used to be a different person, Clara. Remember when you were dating Brody? Now that was a kid who knew how to live. He worked hard with his hands, sure, but he didn't act like he was king of the castle. He'd be out here right now helping me prep the deck, probably drinking a beer and cracking jokes. If you'd married Brody, we'd all be out on the lake this weekend, not sitting here getting lectured by a corporate clerk." Brody. Elias remembered Brody. He was Clara's high school sweetheart, a charming, perpetually underemployed carpenter who had spent his 20s drifting from job to job, borrowing money from Gary that he never paid back, and drinking heavily on the weekends. The Miller family loved him because Brody had no boundaries. He was fun because he was just as chaotic and undisciplined as they were. He was a mirror they liked looking into. "Brody was family," Trent added, his sneer widening as he saw Clara's shoulders drop. "He actually cared. He didn't look down on us just because he had a fancy suit." Elias looked at his wife. Clara's face was flushed. She was still looking down, but she didn't object. She didn't say, "Don't talk about my husband like that." She didn't say, "Elias works hard for us." Instead, she took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine. Her silence acts as a quiet, venomous consent to the comparison. She wanted Elias to feel the sting of it. She wanted him to be hurt, to be jealous, to be driven by a desperate need to prove his worth to her family. An internal calculation occurred. The metabolic cost of jealousy, of outrage, of a defensive outburst was immense. It would require him to scream, to list his accomplishments, to remind them that his fancy suit paid for Clara's Volvo, for the mortgage on their colonial home, for the very steaks they were currently chewing. It would turn this into a domestic drama, a noisy, emotional spectacle where they could cast themselves as the warm, hard-working victims of his cold arrogance. Instead, Elias felt a profound, ice-cold wave of relief. The unwritten contract of their marriage had just been breached, completely and irreparably, in the dim, yellow-orange light of this dining room. The boundary of his loyalty had been crossed. He had spent 7 years protecting these people from their own stupidity, carrying their legal liabilities on his back, and they had just compared him unfavorably to a man who had left Clara with credit card debt and a broken lease. He was no longer obligated to protect them. The shield was gone. Elias did not flinch. His face remained perfectly serene, a smooth, unreadable mask of polite detachment. He carefully picked up his paper napkin, folded it into a neat, tight rectangle, and placed it on the table next to his empty water glass. "Excuse me," Elias said quietly. He pushed his chair back. The metal legs scraped softly against the linoleum. He stood up, adjusted his cuffs, and walked down the short hallway toward the bathroom, leaving the three of them sitting in the suffocating heat of the dining room, their petty, cruel words hanging in the air,
with nowhere left to go. The bathroom of Gary's house was small, damp, and smelled faintly of aerosol pine and old mildew. The wallpaper was a faded pattern of brown and gold ferns, peeling at the corners where the moisture from the shower had compromised the cheap adhesive. A single bare bulb in the ceiling fixture hummed with a high-pitched electric buzz that vibrated in Elias's ears. Elias walked to the pink porcelain pedestal sink. The cold water tap had a loose washer. When he turned it, the metal handle shuddered before releasing a thin, rusty stream of water. He did not wash his face. Instead, he rolled his sleeves up another inch and held his wrists under the freezing stream. The shock of the cold water on his radial arteries was immediate, a sharp, clean chill that traveled up his arms and settled the last remnants of his physical tension. He watched the water run over his skin, swirling down the drain around a brass ring green with copper oxidation. Through the hollow core wooden door, the muffled sounds of the dining room filtered in. Gary was speaking, his voice a low, self-satisfied rumble. Then came Trent's sharp, braying laugh, the laugh of a young man who believed he had just won a significant victory without ever having to step onto the battlefield. Clara's voice was quieter, a faint murmur that Elias couldn't quite resolve into words, followed by the clink of silverware against paper plates. They were comfortable. They were eating their overcooked steaks, drinking their cheap beer, and congratulating themselves on putting the corporate clerk in his place. They had no idea that the ceiling was already beginning to sag. Elias pulled his phone from his trouser pocket. The screen lit up, casting a cool white glow across his knuckles. He opened his personal secure cloud storage app. He navigated past his active firm files, past his tax documents, and opened a folder labeled Family/Miller. Inside were dozens of files. Miller_deed_transfer_final.pdf. Miller_variance_approved.docx. Trent_LLC_operating_agreement_redline.rtf. Years of invisible labor documented in bytes. He scrolled down to a document titled Miller_Taveran_Water_Dept_Draft.docx. This was the file Elias had spent 3 hours drafting on Sunday night, long after Clara had gone to sleep. It was a masterpiece of administrative law. In it, Elias had identified a critical procedural error made by the Elmridge Municipal Inspector, specifically a failure to provide the required 15-day pre-citation warning under Ordinance 44B before levying the $15,000 fine. If filed by 5 p.m. on Friday afternoon, tomorrow, the appeal would have automatically stayed the water shutoff and forced the city attorney to dismiss the citation entirely. Elias had planned to print it out, notarize it himself at the office, and file it on his way to work tomorrow morning as a quiet, unheralded gift to his father-in-law. Elias hovered his thumb over the file. The metabolic calculation was clean, dry, and instant. The family valued his labor at 0.
They viewed his expertise as a natural right, like gravity or clean air. They only noticed his presence when he refused to be used. If he filed this document, he would save Gary $15,000, preserve the tavern's operations, and receive nothing in return but continued mockery and passive-aggressive resentment from his wife. He tapped the 3 small dots next to the file name. A menu slid up from the bottom of his screen. Share, rename, move, delete. Elias tapped delete. The screen prompted him with a standard system-level warning. Are you sure you want to permanently delete Miller_Taveran_water_appeal_draft.docx? This action cannot be undone. Elias's thumb pressed the blue delete button. The file vanished from the list. The folder refreshed, the space where the document had sat closing up instantly, as if it had never existed at all. Tomorrow at 5 p.m., the statutory deadline for Gary to appeal the municipal citation would expire. When the clock struck 5:01, the $15,000 fine would become an unappealable administrative judgment. Under Elmridge Municipal Code, the city's water department would have the immediate legal right to terminate service to Miller's Tavern without further notice. Gary's restaurant would have no water. He would have to close his kitchen. He would have to lay off his staff. And because Gary had no savings and operated on a razor-thin cash flow, the closure of even a single weekend would trigger a cascade of default clauses on his commercial food suppliers and his business insurance. The house of cards was ready to fall, and Elias had just stepped out of the way of the wind. He locked his phone and slid it back into his pocket. He took a rough, yellowed towel hanging from a plastic ring on the wall. The fabric was stiff, smelling faintly of sour laundry detergent, but he dried his hands thoroughly, paying close attention to the spaces between his fingers. He pulled his sleeves back down to his wrists, fastening the silver buttons of his cuffs with steady, unhurried movements. He looked at himself in the mirror. His face was calm. His gray eyes were clear. The exhaustion that had dogged him all week replaced by a cold, quiet serenity. He opened the bathroom door and stepped back into the hallway, ready to rejoin the dinner table. When Elias stepped back into the dining room, the conversation died instantly. Gary was leaning back in his vinyl chair, a wooden toothpick wedged into the corner of his mouth, his thick fingers tracing the rim of his empty beer can. Trent had returned to his phone, the blue light of the screen reflecting off his greasy forehead. Clara sat with her hands clasped in her lap, her posture stiff, her eyes darting to Elias the moment his leather soles clicked onto the linoleum. They were waiting for the storm. They expected him to be cold or silent, or perhaps to make a quiet, passive-aggressive excuse to leave immediately. Instead, Elias pulled his chair out and sat down. His movements were fluid and unhurried. He looked at his half-eaten steak, then up at Gary, offering a small, polite nod. "The steak was prepared exactly to your liking, Gary," Elias said. His voice was smooth, completely devoid of the tension that had filled the room 10 minutes ago. "Thank you for hosting us." Gary blinked. The toothpick in his mouth shifted as his jaw dropped a fraction of an inch. He had spent the last 10 minutes mentally rehearsing his defense for when Elias inevitably snapped, preparing to call him oversensitive or too proud. To have his hostility met with genuine, polite gratitude was like swinging a heavy fist at the air and losing his balance. "Oh," Gary grunted, his face flushing a deeper shade of red as he scrambled to adjust his posture. "Yeah, well, glad you liked it, bud. I always say a good sear is everything." "Indeed," Elias said. He picked up his fork, took a small, neat bite of the instant mashed potatoes, and chewed thoroughly. Clara watched him, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. She looked between Elias and her father, her fingers tightening around her napkin. This was not the script she was familiar with. Usually, when her family insulted Elias, he would withdraw into a quiet, visible hurt, which she would then have to soothe on the drive home with half-hearted apologies. Or he would argue, allowing her to play the role of the peacemaker. His complete serenity was deeply unsettling. It was as if they had thrown a stone into a deep well and heard no splash. Elias checked his watch, 8:12 p.m. He set his fork down, placing it precisely parallel to his knife on the paper plate. He took a slow, measured sip of his water, then wiped his mouth with his paper napkin, folding it once more before setting it down. "We should head out," Elias said, looking at Clara. "I have an early conference call with our European Council tomorrow morning at 6. I need to review the updated disclosure schedules before then." Clara swallowed, her eyes lingering on his face. "Oh, right, sure. Let me help my dad clean up the plates first." "No, don't worry about it, Clara," Gary said, his voice carrying a strange, hollow eagerness. The polite distance Elias had established was making him anxious, though he didn't understand why. "Trent and I will handle it. You guys go ahead. Get some rest." "Thank you, Gary," Elias said. He stood up, smoothing the front of his trousers. He walked to the entryway, slipped his feet back into his polished Oxfords, and retrieved his suit jacket from the coat rack. He slid his arms into the silk lining with a single, practiced motion, the fabric settling perfectly over his shoulders. The goodbyes were brief and mechanical. Elias shook Gary's hand, his grip firm and professional, and offered Trent a polite, distant nod. Trent didn't look up from his phone, but his thumb hovered over the screen, his bravado replaced by a quiet, sullen confusion. The air outside was cool and wet, the rain having completely stopped, leaving the asphalt of the driveway dark and gleaming under the streetlights. They climbed into Elias's sedan. The heavy doors closed with a solid, pressurized thud that shut out the humid night air and the distant rumble of the highway. Elias started the engine. The dashboard came to life, casting a pale blue glow over his hands as he gripped the steering wheel. He shifted into reverse, backing down the cracked driveway with practiced ease, his eyes scanning the mirrors. As they turned onto the main avenue, Clara sat in the passenger seat, her head turned toward the window, watching the wet trees and dark lawns slip past. The silence in the car was thick, punctuated only by the rhythmic clicking of the turn signal and the low hum of the tires on the wet pavement. 10 minutes passed before she spoke. "Elias," she said quietly, her voice barely rising above the noise of the road. She didn't look at him. "I'm sorry about what they said. About Brody." She was probing. She wanted to open the wound, to see if it was still bleeding, to reassure herself that she still possessed the power to hurt him. "There is no need to apologize, Clara," Elias said. His voice was calm, steady, and entirely neutral. He didn't look away from the road, his eyes tracking the white lines and the asphalt. "Your family's perspectives are their own." Clara turned her head slowly, staring at his profile in the dim light of the dashboard. "You're not angry?" "No," Elias said. You're not even a little upset that my dad compared you to my ex-boyfriend at his own dinner table?" Her voice rose slightly, a note of genuine anxiety slipping into her tone. "Upsetting myself over things I cannot control is an inefficient use of my energy, Clara," Elias said, his voice dropping into a quiet, logical register. "Your father has his opinions, and Trent has his frustrations. It is not my responsibility to correct them." Clara stared at him, her lips parting slightly. She had expected a fight. She had expected to have to defend her family, to tell him that they didn't mean it that way, to slowly wear down his anger until he agreed to help them again. But his lack of anger was terrifying. It was a complete, silent withdrawal of care. It was the realization that he didn't just stop arguing. He had stopped caring enough to argue. She looked back out the window, her fingers trembling as she gripped her purse. The road ahead was dark, wet, and empty, stretching out into the quiet of the suburban night. The golden light of a clear Friday morning cut through the slats of the dressing room blinds, casting a series of sharp amber bars across the hardwood floor. The rain of the previous night had completely washed the air clean, leaving the morning crisp and cool, though the rising sun promised a heavy, humid heat by afternoon. Elias stood before his dresser, his fingers resting on the crown of his vintage automatic watch. He wound it slowly, a precise mechanical routine. Click, click, click. He felt the tiny, delicate resistance of the mainspring through his fingertips, a small, controlled tension that dictated the movement of the hands. He set the time to exactly 5:50 a.m., pushed the crown in with a soft, metallic click, and buckled the dark brown crocodile leather strap around his left wrist. He adjusted his cuffs. Today he wore a charcoal wool suit, a light blue cotton shirt, and a dark gray silk tie. It was his closing suit. It was the armor he wore when millions of dollars changed hands, when corporate entities were dissolved, and when the legal realities he had structured over months of quiet, meticulous labor were finally executed. He opened his leather briefcase on the bench, slid his laptop and the physical signature pages for the logistics acquisition inside, and snapped the brass locks shut. Snap, snap. He walked downstairs, his leather shoes silent on the carpeted stairs, but stepping with a firm, rhythmic weight onto the hardwood of the foyer. In the kitchen, the air was still cool, but the smell of burnt toast hung in the drafts. Clara was sitting at the island, her fleece robe wrapped tightly around her shoulders, despite the warming morning. She was holding a mug of tea in both hands, her head bowed over the steam. She looked small, her face pale and drawn, her eyes bearing the heavy, shadowed look of someone who had spent the night staring at the ceiling. She looked up as Elias entered. "You're leaving early," she said. Her voice was raspy, stripped of the defensive anger from the night before, replaced by a thin, fragile weariness. "The pre-closing call with our European Council starts at 6, Elias said. walking past her to the espresso machine. He didn't look at her. He kept his focus entirely on the physical routine. He measured the dark roast beans, poured them into the hopper, and turned the grinder on. The high-pitched metallic whine of the burrs filled the kitchen, a loud, abrasive barrier that made any further conversation impossible for 45 seconds. Elias tamped the grounds, locked the portafilter into the group head, and pulled the shot. He stood by the counter, watching the dark, viscous liquid drip into his small ceramic cup, smelling the rich, bitter oils. He drank the espresso standing up, the hot, concentrated liquid coating his mouth and throat, forcing his mind into sharp, immediate focus. Clara cleared her throat, her fingers nervously tapping the side of her ceramic mug. "Elias," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly, "about today. My dad called me again this morning, at 5. He's really sick over this water thing, Elias. He didn't sleep at all. He said he looked at the appeal form on the city website, and he doesn't understand what some of the boxes mean. He's terrified he's going to fill it out wrong, and they'll just throw it away." Elias set his empty espresso cup in the sink. He did not wash it. He let it sit on top of the dirty dishes. "The form is a standard municipal administrative petition," Elias said, his voice level, quiet, and completely detached. "The instructions are designed to be navigated by lay people." "But he's not a lawyer, Elias." Clara's voice rose, a desperate, frantic pitch cutting through the quiet kitchen. She stood up, her robe slipping from her shoulder, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "He's 64 years old and he runs a tavern. He doesn't know what statutory notice compliance means. He said the deadline is 5 o'clock today. If it's not filed by 5, they won't even look at it. The fine stands and they'll cut the water next week." Elias looked at his watch. 5:56 a.m. In his pocket, his phone was a dead weight. In his secure cloud storage trash folder, Miller_tavern_water_appeal_draft.docx was sitting, fully drafted, perfectly formatted, and ready to be printed and filed. It would take him exactly 4 minutes to restore the file, print it at his office, and have Sarah run it down to the municipal courthouse. He could save Gary's restaurant with less effort than it took him to make his morning coffee. But he felt nothing. No guilt, no urge to save them, no desire to purchase her relief with his labor. The ledger had been closed last night. "I am fully booked today, Clara," Elias said, his voice smooth and empty of emotion. "The logistics acquisition closes at noon, followed by a 3-hour post-closing audit. I will not be accessible, and I cannot assist him." "Elias, please!" Clara took a step toward him, her eyes wide, tears beginning to well up in the corners. "He's my dad. He doesn't have anyone else to ask. The lawyers he called this morning want a $3,000 retainer just to look at the citation. He doesn't have $3,000 right now. If you don't help him, he's going to lose everything." Elias picked up his briefcase from the counter. The leather handle was cool and solid in his grip. He looked at his wife, his gray eyes steady and entirely unreadable. "If your father cannot afford a retainer, he will have to complete the form to the best of his ability," Elias said softly. "I must go. I cannot be late for the closing." "Elias!" she cried out as he turned toward the mudroom. He didn't stop. He walked through the mudroom, slid his feet into his polished shoes, and stepped out onto the wet porch. The morning sun was bright, blindingly clear, casting long, dark shadows across the driveway. He climbed into his sedan, started the engine, and backed out of the driveway, leaving the house behind him. It was 6:02 a.m. The countdown to 5 p.m. had officially begun, and Elias was driving toward the glass towers of the city, leaving the Millers to face their own storm. The late afternoon sun of Friday had shifted, casting long, dusty beams of amber light across the expanse of the firm's main conference room. On the massive mahogany table sat 3 thick, black-bound binders, the finalized, executed closing documents for the logistics acquisition. Elias was alone in the room. The other partners and the clients had already moved down to the lobby, their voices echoing in distant, cheerful laughter as they headed toward a celebratory dinner. Elias sat at the head of the table. He picked up his fountain pen, a heavy black lacquer instrument with a gold nib. He took a soft, lint-free microfiber cloth from his briefcase and began to wipe the nib, clearing away the microscopic traces of dark blue ink that had accumulated during the hours of signing. He worked with slow, deliberate precision, tracing the curve of the gold band before screwing the cap back on with a quiet, satisfying thread click. Beside his notebook, his personal phone began to vibrate. The haptic motor buzzed against the polished mahogany, a low, demanding rattle. The screen lit up. Clara. Elias did not pick it up. He watched the screen. As the call rang through to voicemail, the display immediately updated with a stream of text messages, piling on top of each other in a frantic, scrolling cascade. It was 4:45 p.m. 15 minutes before the municipal clerk's office closed for the weekend. Gary, 4:45 p.m. Elias, I'm at the clerk's window. They won't accept my appeal form. They say I didn't attach the original certificate of occupancy, and the notary stamp is on the wrong page. Please talk to this woman. Her name is Brenda. She's being a total bitch. Call me now. Clara, 4:47 p.m. Elias, please pick up. My dad is at the counter, and they're telling him he has 13 minutes. He's having a panic attack. Just call the clerk's office. You know these people. Please do this for me. Gary, 4:50 p.m. Elias, they're telling me I can't file it on Monday. It has to be today. If you don't call this lady right now, they're going to shut the water off next week. Answer the phone. Trent, 4:52 p.m. You're a real piece of work. If we lose the tavern because you wanted to play the big shot, you're dead to us. Clara is crying her eyes out because of you. Elias read the messages, his eyes moving smoothly from line to line. His face remained entirely devoid of tension. He looked down at his watch. 4:54 p.m. His mind began to run the necessary legal calculations, an automatic diagnostic reflex. Gary's appeal was being rejected because Gary had failed to include the chain of title documentation required for commercial entities under Municipal Code Section 12A. Without it, the clerk had no legal authority to accept the filing. Gary had likely tried to argue to use his local business owner status to bully the clerk, which had only made her dig her heels in. Elias knew the clerk, Brenda. He had worked with her for 5 years on municipal filings. He also knew her supervisor, Harold, who sat in the corner office on the 3rd floor of the municipal building. If Elias picked up his desk phone right now, he could call Harold's direct line. He could explain that his father-in-law was a layperson who had made a clerical error.
He could promise that he would personally deliver the amended documentation on Monday morning, and Harold would tell Brenda to stamp the appeal as received today. It would take exactly 90 seconds. A single brief exercise of his professional social capital, and Gary's Tavern would be safe. Elias set his fountain pen down on his notebook. He picked up his glass of water. The ice had long since melted, but the water was still cool. He took a slow, measured sip, feeling the liquid coat his dry throat. If we lose the tavern because you wanted to play the big shot, you're dead to us. Trent's words swam on the screen. Dead to us. It was the ultimate, unvarnished truth of their relationship. To them, Elias's value was entirely conditional. He was only alive to them, only worthy of their respect, when his neck was bent under the weight of their burdens. The moment he stood upright, the moment he demanded the basic respect of his time and his boundaries, he was a monster. Elias looked at his watch. 4:57 p.m. The golden light in the conference room was fading, turning a deep, bruised purple as the sun dipped behind the opposite skyscraper. The office was quiet, the only sound the low, steady rush of the HVAC system. He watched the second hand of his watch sweep past the Roman numerals on the dial. 4:58 p.m. His phone buzzed again. Another call from Clara. The vibration was shorter this time, as if the phone itself were running out of breath. He let it ring. He let it die. 4:59 p.m. Elias stood up. He picked up the 3 heavy closing binders, his leather briefcase, and his notebook. He walked to the conference room door and paused, his hand resting on the brushed steel door handle. He looked back at his watch. The minute hand clicked forward, settling precisely on the 12. 5 p.m. The municipal clerk's office was closed. The steel security grates of the Elmridge City building were currently sliding down, locking out the public. The statutory deadline for the appeal of Gary Miller's municipal citation had officially expired. The $15,000 fine was now a final, unappealable civil judgment. The administrative order to terminate water services to Miller's Tavern was active, and the municipal work order would be dispatched to the field technicians first thing Monday morning. Elias pressed down on the door handle. The latch gave way with a soft, clean click. He stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway of his firm, his face perfectly serene, his mind already turning to his plans for the weekend. The shield was gone, the trap had snapped shut, and he had not had to say a single angry word. The headlights of Elias's sedan swept across the front of his house, illuminating the white colonial columns in a brief, stark glare before he turned the ignition off. In the driveway, Gary's rusted pickup truck sat parked at a violent angle, its front left tire resting fully on the manicured lawn. A dark, slow drip of black motor oil was already beginning to pool on the pristine concrete of the driveway directly beneath the truck's engine block. Beside it, Clara's Volvo was parked crookedly, its driver's side door left slightly ajar, the interior dome light casting a pale yellow glow over the leather seats. Elias sat in the quiet of his car for 3 slow, measured breaths. He unbuckled his seatbelt, picked up his briefcase, and stepped out into the cooling evening air. The smell of cut grass and damp earth was overridden by the hot, metallic scent of Gary's overworked truck engine. As Elias approached the front door,
He could hear the muffled, chaotic sound of shouting from within the house. He turned his key in the deadbolt. The lock gave way with its familiar solid click, and he pushed the door open. The foyer was a scene of domestic invasion.
Gary was pacing the length of the hardwood hallway, his face a dark, dangerous shade of purple, sweat sticking his gray hair to his forehead. He was still wearing his grease-stained work polo, his heavy work boots tracking wet, dark clods of garden soil and grass clippings across the cream-colored runner rug. Trent was slumped against the banister of the stairs, his arms crossed, a dark, sullen scowl on his face. On the bottom step of the staircase sat Clara. Her head was buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with quiet, exhausted sobs. Her purse and keys were scattered on the floor beside her like debris from a collision. Gary spun around the moment the front door clicked shut. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and wild with a mixture of terror and furious disbelief. "Where the hell have you been?" Gary bellowed, his voice echoing off the high ceiling of the foyer. He took 2 heavy steps toward Elias, pointing a thick, trembling index finger at his chest. "We called you 50 times, Elias, 50 times." Clara was screaming into her phone. "I was at the window. The clerk locked the goddamn grate right in my face. She wouldn't take the paper." Elias did not flinch. He did not step back. He quietly closed the front door behind him, turning the deadbolt back into place. He set his briefcase down on the entryway bench with a soft, deliberate thud. He took off his charcoal suit jacket, shook it once to clear any dust, and hung it precisely on the wooden hanger in the coat closet. "I was in a closing," Elias said. His voice was flat, quiet, and perfectly measured, a stark contrast to the vibrating, sweaty rage filling the hallway. "A closing!" Gary screamed, his chest heaving as he stepped closer, the smell of cheap tobacco and stale beer washing over Elias. "My tavern is getting shut down next week, Elias. My water. Do you know what they do when they shut off the water? I can't run the dishwashers. I can't prep food. The health department will pull my license in 12 hours. I'm ruined. Everything I've built for 30 years is gone because you couldn't take a 90-second phone call." "He did it on purpose, Dad," Trent muttered from the stairs, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "Look at him. He doesn't even care. He's been planning this since Tuesday." Clara looked up from the steps, her eyes red, swollen, and wet with tears. She looked at Elias with a desperate, pleading agony. "Elias, please, tell them there's a way to fix it. Can't you call someone on Monday? You know the department head. You told me you did. Just tell my dad you can call him on Monday morning and get an extension. Please, just say something." Elias looked at his wife. He saw the raw panic in her eyes, the complete collapse of her emotional equilibrium. She was realizing for the first time in her life that the invisible shield that had protected her and her family from the consequences of their own actions was gone. She was staring at the raw, cold wind of reality, and she was terrified. The internal scale in Elias's mind remained perfectly balanced. He calculated the energy required to explain, once again, the concept of statutory deadlines. He calculated the energy required to absorb Gary's screaming, to placate Clara's tears, to purchase their temporary peace
with a promise to spend his weekend drafting a desperate, futile emergency motion for an injunction. The return on investment was zero. The cost was his life. The deadline for filing an administrative appeal was 5 o'clock today, Elias said quietly, his eyes settling on Gary's dirt-caked boots. The municipal building is closed. The city's water department will dispatch a technician to terminate utility services to your property on Tuesday morning at 8 o'clock. Gary stared at him, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish gasping for air.
The absolute lack of panic in Elias's voice, the cold, clinical delivery of the timeline, seemed to paralyze his rage. "You," Gary whispered, his voice cracking. "You're just going to let them do it? You're not going to help me?" "I do not represent you, Gary," Elias said softly. "I suggest you spend your weekend searching for a licensed plumbing contractor who can install a grease interceptor under an expedited emergency permit. It is your only legal recourse." "You son of a bitch," Gary roared, taking another step forward, his fists clenching at his sides. "Dad, stop!" Clara cried out, jumping up from the stairs and grabbing her father's arm. Elias did not move. He met Gary's furious, panicked gaze with a cool, steady stare that held no anger, no fear, and no pity. It was the stare of a creditor looking at a defaulted account. He picked up his briefcase from the bench. "I am going to the study," Elias said. He walked past them, his shoulder not even brushing Gary's polo shirt, and walked down the quiet hallway, leaving the three of them standing in the ruined foyer, their shouts dying down into a cold, terrifying silence. The heavy mahogany door of the study was closed, shutting out the rest of the house. Inside, the only light came from the brass banker's lamp on Elias's desk, its green glass shade casting a soft emerald glow over his hands and the polished walnut surface. The room was perfectly silent, save for the rhythmic, mechanical ticking of the small silver clock on the bookshelf. 10:14 p.m. Gary and Trent had left nearly an hour ago. The departure had been a noisy, chaotic affair, the slamming of truck doors, the grinding of Gary's starter motor, and the angry squeal of tires on the damp asphalt of the street. But here, in the study, the air was still and cool, insulated from the wreckage of the foyer. Elias sat in his leather chair. He opened his laptop, the screen reflecting a pale white light across his face. He did not open his firm's active files. Instead, he opened a blank spreadsheet. He began to type. His fingers moved across the keyboard with a steady, rhythmic cadence, the sound of a ledger being calculated. He was compiling a document. For 7 years, he had kept meticulous, private records of every legal matter he had handled for the Miller family. He had done it not out of malice, but out of professional habit. A lawyer's mind naturally documents the passage of time and liability. October 2021, Gary Miller, zoning variance, 14.5 hours. March 2022, Gary Miller, commercial lease review, 8.0 hours. August 2023, Trent Miller, operating agreement drafting, 11.2 hours. November 2024, Gary Miller, state tax audit resolution, 24.0 hours. January 2025, Trent Miller, wedding venue contract dispute resolution, 9.5 hours. Elias paused on the last entry. Trent was engaged to be married in September.
3 months from now. He had planned an extravagant, expensive wedding at a high-end, historic manor house downtown. A wedding Gary had agreed to fund using a line of credit secured against the tavern's property. 6 months ago, the venue had attempted to cancel the reservation due to a double booking, invoking a clause that would have stripped Trent of his $12,000 deposit. Elias had spent his entire weekend drafting a high-pressure demand letter and negotiating a settlement that not only reinstated the date, but secured a 15% discount on the catering fees. It was $8,000 of free municipal contract litigation, delivered to Trent in a neat white envelope. Elias continued typing, his eyes tracking the columns of numbers as they began to stack. By the time he finished, the spreadsheet held 24 separate entries spanning 7 years. The total came to exactly 138 hours of highly specialized, partner-level legal labor.
Elias clicked the cell at the bottom of the column and entered his standard corporate billing rate of $750 an hour. He pressed the Enter key. The digital display updated instantly. $103,500. $103,500. That was the raw market value currency of the invisible labor he had gifted them. Labor they had dismissed as a simple piece of paper and a 90-second phone call. The soft metallic click of the study door handle broke the silence. The door opened slowly. Clara stood on the threshold. She was wearing a heavy wool coat, and she was holding a small leather duffel bag in her right hand. The leather was worn, the brass zipper slightly tarnished. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen from crying, her mouth set in a hard, defensive line. She stared at him, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. She was waiting for him to look up, to see the suitcase, to realize the finality of her departure. She was waiting for the panic to finally show on his face. Elias slowly closed his laptop screen exactly 3 inches, stopping so the glow of the display still illuminated his hands. He looked up, his gray eyes calm, steady, and entirely devoid of heat. "I'm going to my dad's," Clara said, her voice thin and trembling, but carrying a sharp, defensive edge. "He needs me right now. I cannot stay in this house with someone who treats my family like a business transaction. I cannot look at you right now, Elias." She stood perfectly still, her knuckles white around the handle of the duffel bag. She was waiting. In her mind, this was the moment he would finally break. He would stand up from his desk, close his laptop fully, and beg her to stay. He would apologize for his coldness, tell her he would call the city attorney on Monday morning, and promise to make it right for Gary. She had used this lever before, her withdrawal, her anger, and it had always eventually brought him to heel. Elias looked at her. He saw the duffel bag, the tear-stained face, the calculated theatricality of her exit. He felt a profound, absolute silence settle over his mind. The metabolic cost of her drama was a currency he simply no longer possessed. He had no desire to buy her back. "I understand," Elias said softly. His voice was level, polite, and entirely neutral, the voice of a hotel clerk checking out a guest. "Please make sure to lock the garage door behind you. The deadbolt has a tendency to stick in this humidity." Clara blinked. Her jaw dropped slightly, her face twisting in a look of complete, stunned disbelief.
"That's it?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "That's all you have to say to me? You're just letting me leave?" "You are an adult, Clara," Elias said, his voice quiet. "You are free to choose where you spend your evening. If you believe your father's home is where you need to be, I will not prevent you from going." "You are monstrous, Elias," she spat, her voice rising in a desperate, furious pitch as the realization of her complete lack of leverage began to sink in. Tears spilled over her lower lashes, hot and fast. "You really are. When my dad's restaurant closes on Tuesday, it's on your head. I hope your partner track was worth your marriage." She turned, her coat swirling around her ankles, and slammed the heavy mahogany doors shut. The force of the impact rattled the picture frames on the bookshelves, a loud, violent bang that echoed through the quiet house. A moment later, Elias heard the distant, muffled rumble of the garage door opening, followed by the quiet hum of her Volvo starting up and backing down the driveway. Then silence returned. Elias sat alone in the green glow of the banker's lamp. He looked at his laptop screen. He clicked the icon for his printer. In the corner of the room, the small laser printer began to warm up with a low mechanical whir, its internal roller spinning before releasing a single, crisp sheet of white paper into the tray. Elias stood up, walked to the printer, and picked up the page. The paper was hot, smelling faintly of ozone and toner. On it was the complete, detailed ledger of his 7 years of unbilled labor. He folded the paper into 3 perfect horizontal folds, slid it into a clean white envelope, and left it resting on the center of his desk. The catalyst was complete. The final line had been crossed, and the invoice was ready. The house on Saturday morning was filled with a deep, cavernous quiet that Elias had not experienced in years. Without the soft, persistent scuff of Clara's slippers, the abrasive hum of Trent's phone videos, or the sudden, erratic vibrations of the landline ringing with Gary's latest crisis, the air in the Colonial felt clean and still. The morning sun streamed through the tall living room windows, illuminating the dust motes suspended in the quiet air, casting long geometric patterns of light across the hardwood floors. Elias went through his physical routine with slow, deliberate pleasure. He stood at the kitchen island, boiling water for a single cup of pour-over coffee. He measured the beans on a digital scale, exactly 20 grams, and ground them manually, the wooden handle of the cast iron grinder smooth and heavy in his hand. The rich, earthy scent of freshly cracked coffee beans rose from the drawer, filling the clean kitchen. He poured the water in a slow, concentric stream over the paper filter, watching the grounds bloom and bubble. He did not rush. He had no meetings today. He had no active files to review. He had only the quiet of his own space. He sat at the island, taking a slow sip of the coffee. It was hot, dark, and perfectly clean, completely free of the milky, lukewarm residue of the cups Clara usually prepared. At 8:12 a.m., his phone gave a single, quiet chime on the counter. Elias picked it up. It was a high-priority alert from People's Trust Bank, where his and Clara's primary accounts were held. Alert! Outgoing transfer of $5,000
initiated from joint savings account X-4892 to Miller, Gary. Status pending. Elias looked at the screen. A slow, clinical smile almost touched the corners of his mouth. He had anticipated this exact move. Clara had gone to her father's house, witnessed the absolute panic of his impending ruin, and decided to use the only weapon she believed she had left, Elias's money. A $5,000 cash transfer was the exact amount a predatory, weekend-rate local attorney would demand to file an emergency administrative injunction to stay the Tuesday water shutoff. Elias had not frozen the joint account entirely. To do so would have been legally problematic, a hostile action that a family court judge would look upon with disfavor in the event of a divorce filing. Instead, he had quietly activated a standard dual authorization security feature on the account 3 months ago, under the guise of protecting their assets from digital fraud. Under the terms of the bank's security protocol, any transfer exceeding $1,000 from the joint account required independent mobile confirmation from both account holders. Elias opened the banking app. He looked at the pending transaction. Under Clara's digital signature, the red flashing prompt read, "Awaiting secondary approval from Elias Adler." He tapped Decline. The screen refreshed. Transaction canceled. Notification sent to primary user. He set the phone back down on the granite counter and took another sip of his coffee. He counted the seconds in his mind. 1, 2, 3. At 48 seconds, the phone began to vibrate violently against the stone, the screen lighting up with Clara's caller ID. Elias let it ring twice before he picked it up and tapped the screen, bringing the phone to his ear. "Why did you decline the transfer?" Clara's voice was hysterical, rising in a sharp, nasal shriek that distorted through the phone's speaker. He could hear the frantic, ambient noise of her father's house in the background, the television blaring, the heavy clink of coffee mugs, Gary's low, angry grunting. "Good morning, Clara," Elias said. His voice was quiet, steady, and perfectly calm, the tone of a partner addressing a junior associate who had made a minor procedural error. "Elias, don't do this!" she cried out, her voice cracking with a mixture of rage and terror. "My dad needs that money right now. We found a lawyer in town, Mr. Henderson, who said he can draft an emergency petition today if we pay a $5,000 cash retainer. He has to do it today so we can get a judge to sign it before Tuesday. Why are you locking me out of my own money?" "The savings in that account are joint marital assets, Clara," Elias said, his tone conversational and polite. "Under our financial agreement, any transfer exceeding $1,000 requires mutual written consent and a designated joint purpose. Funding your father's administrative litigation does not meet that criteria." "It's my money, too," she screamed. "I work. I contribute to this household." "Your individual checking account at the same branch holds a balance of $4,212, Elias replied, stating the numbers from memory. "Those funds are entirely yours to utilize. You are free to transfer them to your father's lawyer as you see fit." "You know that's not enough," she sobbed, her voice dropping into a desperate, pleading whisper. "The lawyer wants $5,000 flat. He won't even open the file for a penny less.
Elias, please. If we don't get the injunction, the city is going to shut the tavern's water off on Tuesday. My dad will have to close the doors.
He's going to lose everything. Just let me use the $5,000. I'll pay it back. I promise.
The answer is no, Clara, Elias said. The simplicity of his refusal was devastating. He didn't argue. He didn't bring up her family's insults from the night before. He didn't mention Brody or the billable hours or the deleted appeal draft. He simply stated his position and let it stand like a concrete wall. "You're a monster," she whispered, her voice trembling so violently he could hear the breath catching in her throat. "You're literally destroying my family because you want to punish me. I can't believe I married you." "I hope you find a way to resolve the retainer with your individual funds," Elias said softly. "Have a productive weekend, Clara." He tapped the screen, ending the call. He set the phone face down on the counter, picked up his pour-over mug, and walked over to the window. Outside, the morning breeze was gently rustling the leaves of the oak trees, the green lawn bright and beautiful under the summer sky. He felt the cold, hard certainty of his complete control over his life settling into his bones. The buffer was officially gone, and the Millers were finally learning the true cost of the water they had taken for granted. The afternoon sun of Saturday had dipped lower, casting long, pale bars of gold through the heavy velvet curtains of Elias's study. The light illuminated the thin layer of dust on the spines of his law journals, creating a quiet, scholarly sanctuary in the heart of the empty house. Elias sat at his desk, a crystal tumbler of sparkling water resting on a leather coaster beside his keyboard. The ice had melted, but the water was still cold, the small carbonated bubbles rising lazily to the surface. He put on his thin, silver-framed reading glasses, adjusting them precisely on the bridge of his nose. He opened his personal email inbox. Buried beneath a handful of subscription alerts and a newsletter from the State Bar Association was a single message from Trent, time-stamped Friday, 4:51 p.m. It had been sent exactly 9 minutes before the municipal clerk's office closed, right in the middle of Gary's frantic, failed attempt to file his water department appeal. The subject line was a single, defiant word: guarantee. The body of the email was brief, typed in a hurried, aggressive script. Signed it anyway. Landlord's lawyer drafted a standard one. You're not the only lawyer in the world, Elias. We don't need you. Attached to the email was a scanned PDF file. Executed _lease _and _guarantee .pdf. Elias clicked the icon. The file opened in a crisp white window on his monitor. He scrolled past the first 20 pages of the standard commercial lease agreement for the vapor shop. His eyes, trained by a decade of corporate risk analysis, skipped past the boilerplate clauses, the utility allocations, and the maintenance schedules, stopping directly on page 22, Exhibit D, Unconditional Personal Guarantee. The signatures at the bottom of the page were written in hurried, messy, blue ballpoint ink. Trent's signature was large and chaotic, looping off the line. Beneath it, Gary's signature was a tight, shaky scrawl, the pen pressure so heavy it had likely indented the paper beneath it. They had signed it. Elias leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers tented beneath his chin, his eyes scanning the paragraphs drafted by the landlord's counsel, Garrison and Croft, an aggressive commercial real estate firm downtown known for their predatory, ironclad instruments. The document was a legal slaughterhouse. Under Clause 14.2, the guarantor, Gary, unconditionally and irrevocably guaranteed the full, prompt, and complete payment of all rent, triple net fees, and operational costs for the entire 60-month term of the lease. Clause 14.5 was even more devastating. Acceleration upon default.
In the event of a default by the tenant, They Paven LLC, the landlord reserved the immediate unilateral right to accelerate the entire remaining balance of the 5-year lease, making the full sum of $480,000 immediately due and payable by the guarantor. Furthermore, under Clause 14.8, Gary had waived all rights of subrogation, all rights of contribution, and all legal defenses, including any claim of landlord mitigation. He had essentially agreed that if Trent failed to pay the $8,000 monthly rent for even a single month, the landlord could bypass Trent entirely and sue Gary for nearly $500,000, with Gary legally barred from presenting any defense in court. And to secure this guarantee, Gary had listed the physical property of Miller's Tavern and his primary residential home as qualified personal assets. Elias took a slow, quiet sip of his sparkling water. The carbonation ticked against his tongue. They believed they had won. They believed they had bypassed his strict rules and showed him that they could navigate the professional world without his help. In their desperate, arrogant rush to secure Trent's dream before the Friday afternoon deadline, they had allowed a predatory corporate landlord to wrap a $500,000 noose around Gary's neck. And on Tuesday morning at 8 a.m., the city was going to shut off the tavern's water. Without water, Gary's restaurant would default on its operations. Without operations, Gary's cash flow would evaporate in 72 hours. He would default on his commercial food suppliers. He would default on his business insurance. And within 30 days, Trent's Vapor Shop, which relied entirely on Gary's personal credit line for its initial inventory financing, would default on its rent. The moment Trent defaulted, Garrison and Croft would file an accelerated breach of contract lawsuit. They would execute the personal guarantee. They would attach Gary's assets. They would seize the tavern, foreclose on his house, and leave Gary Miller completely, utterly bankrupt. Elias slowly took off his reading glasses and set them on the desk. He opened his firm's secure document portal. He selected a blank template, the elegant embossed header of his firm appearing at the top of the digital page. Adler and Associates, LLC. He began to draft a formal professional document. It was not a defense. It was not an appeal. It was a formal conflict of interest and non-representation letter addressed to Gary Miller and Trent Miller. In it, Elias officially and permanently recused himself from representing or advising either party in any current or future municipal, administrative, or commercial real estate matters, citing a direct, irreconcilable conflict of interest under Bar Association Rule 1.7. At the bottom of the letter, he added a single, cold, professional paragraph. Please be advised that any review of files, documents, or executed agreements performed by this firm at your request prior to this formal recusal will be billed at our standard, non-contractual corporate rate of $750 per hour. A detailed invoice for past consultations and administrative analysis is attached herewith.
Elias clicked print. In the corner of the study, the laser printer warmed up with a soft mechanical whine. The rollers spun, releasing a single hot sheet of paper into the tray. Elias stood up, picked up the page, and held it under the green light of the banker's lamp. The ink was fresh, smelling faintly of heated toner. He slid the recusal letter into the white envelope, right next to the $103,000 ledger of his 7 years of unbilled labor. The execution was complete. He didn't have to raise his voice. He didn't have to show anger. He had simply stepped aside, and the family's own arrogance and weaponized incompetence had done the rest, constructing a ruin so complete that no lawyer in the state could save them. Tuesday morning arrived with a sky the color of cold slate. At exactly 7:55 a.m., Elias sat in his quiet kitchen, his hands wrapped around a clean ceramic mug of black espresso. The house was entirely silent, the air still, smelling faintly of the rain that had fallen overnight. Through the kitchen window, he watched the neighborhood's suburban streets slowly wake up, the automated sprinklers on his pristine lawn rising from the grass with a soft mechanical hiss. 2 miles away on 10th Street, a bright yellow municipal utility truck pulled up to the curb directly in front of Miller's Tavern. The technician, wearing a faded high-visibility vest and heavy leather gloves, stepped out of the cab carrying a long T-shaped iron curb key. He walked to the circular water meter cover embedded in the concrete sidewalk behind the restaurant, slid the key into the slot, and twisted his shoulders. Beneath the pavement, inside the damp concrete vault, the heavy bronze valve turned with a dull metallic clunk. Inside the kitchen of the tavern, Gary Miller was standing by the commercial sink, his face pale, his eyes rimmed with red from a sleepless weekend. He turned the handle of the faucet to wash a stack of breakfast plates. The tap sputtered. A dry, hollow hiss of escaping air echoed through the pipes, followed by a few sluggish, rusty drops of water. Then, nothing. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. Gary stared at the dry faucet, the metal handle cold and useless in his hand, as the reality of the municipal shutdown finally settled into the room like a physical weight. At 9:15 a.m., a certified courier truck pulled up to Gary's residential home. Clara was sitting on the front porch steps, her knees pulled to her chest, her oversized sweater wrapped tightly around her. Beside her sat Trent, his head buried in his hands, his phone lying silent on the wooden deck between his feet. They had spent the last 48 hours trying to secure another lawyer, but every firm they called had demanded a $5,000 cash retainer up front, a sum they simply could not assemble after Elias had declined the joint account transfer. The courier stepped out of the truck carrying a stiff cardboard overnight envelope. "Gary Miller?" the courier asked, looking at his clipboard. Gary, who had just arrived from the Dry Tavern, stepped out of his pickup truck, his movements slow and heavy. "Yeah, that's me." "Sign here, please." Gary scribbled his name on the electronic screen. The courier handed him the envelope and walked back to his truck. Gary stood in the gravel driveway, his hands trembling slightly as he tore the pull tab of the thick cardboard envelope. The sound of the paper tearing was sharp, like a dry branch snapping. Inside were 3 documents, bound together by a heavy steel paperclip. Gary pulled them out. Clara and Trent stood up, walking down the steps to stand beside him, their eyes fixed on the white pages. The first document was on the elegant embossed letterhead of Adler and Associates, LLC. It was the formal conflict of interest and non-representation letter. Gary's eyes scanned the clinical professional language. Due to an irreconcilable conflict of interest under Bar Association Rule 1.7, this firm hereby recuses itself from any current or future representation of Gary Miller, Trent Miller, or Vape Haven, LLC. He's dropping us, Clara whispered, her voice cracking as she read over her father's shoulder. He's really dropping us. Gary didn't answer. He turned to the second document. It was a detailed 24-item corporate invoice listing every hour Elias had spent on their zoning variances, their tax disputes, their lease negotiations, and Trent's wedding contract disputes over the last 7 years. At the bottom of the page, the total sum was written in bold black ink. Total due $103,500. Attached to the invoice was a formal notice of intent to file a civil claim for quantum merit recovery if the balance was not settled within 30 days. Gary's hand shook so violently the paper rattled in the morning breeze. He had no water, he had no business, and now he had a $100,000 debt to his son-in-law that Elias had the absolute legal power to collect. But it was the third document that delivered the final devastating blow. It was a copy of the personal guarantee Trent had signed on Friday afternoon to secure his vapor shop lease, the document Trent had bragged about signing without Elias's help. Elias had used a yellow highlighter to mark 2 specific sections. Clause 14.5, acceleration upon default. Clause 14.8, waiver of all defenses and consent to seizure of personal assets. In the margin beside the highlighted text, Elias had written a single neat note in black ink. With the tavern closed due to municipal utility termination, your commercial credit line is defaulted. The landlord will accelerate the 5-year lease balance of $480,000 on Monday. Under Clause 14.8, they will initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings on your primary residence and the tavern property to satisfy the debt. You have no legal defense. The paper slipped from Gary's fingers, drifting slowly down to the damp grass of the lawn. Trent stared at the highlighted clauses, his face turning a sickly, translucent white. He looked at his father, then at Clara. "Dad, I didn't know those clauses were in there. The landlord's lawyer said it was a standard form. I thought—" "You ruined us," Gary whispered. His voice was no longer angry. It was empty, a hollow, dead sound. "You signed my house away." Clara fell to her knees on the grass, her hand covering her mouth as she began to sob. The September wedding, the vapor shop, the tavern, the family home, everything they had built on the foundation of Elias's silent, unvalued labor had collapsed in a single terrifying instant. They were bankrupt, defenseless, and entirely alone. Elias sat in his quiet study, the green light of the banker's lamp casting a peaceful glow over his clean desk. He picked up his espresso cup, took one final satisfying sip, and turned his laptop off, leaving the room in the perfect, silent serenity of his own design. The scales of the ledger were finally, perfectly balanced. Some storms do not arrive with thunder. They arrive with the quiet click of a locked door, the steady sweep of a watch hand, and the dry white paper of a billable hour. This is the silent architecture of retribution. If you found this story of quiet, calculated justice satisfying, consider subscribing to our channel, Crazy Karma Stories. Join our community for more masterfully crafted tales of silent retribution, where the arrogant find their own traps, and the silent architects of the world finally let the scales balance. Tap the notification bell to ensure you never miss a single chapter of our stories. Thank you for listening, and remember, every action eventually finds its invoice.